Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the most quietly persistent questions in conspiracy research, I want to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It truly makes a difference in keeping these stories coming to you. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out tremendously as well. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. Finally, if you enjoy what we do here, consider subscribing. It means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story. This investigation was inspired by suggestions from Unanimous Thix9 and Todd Rockwell. Thank you both for bringing this topic to our attention. The sky doesn't make noise when you look at it. It doesn't resist observation, it simply exists, vast and indifferent, exactly as it has always appeared to be. But somewhere in the archives of human thought, buried beneath centuries of scientific consensus and cultural agreement, there exists a question that refuses to disappear completely. What if everything we believe about the sky is wrong? Not metaphorically wrong, not philosophically incomplete, actually structurally, fundamentally wrong. The thought arrived on a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every way except for the conversation that wouldn't leave my mind. I had been reading through old cosmological texts, the kind of material that rarely surfaces in modern education, but exists in abundance if you know where to look. Religious manuscripts, ancient astronomical records, pre-scientific descriptions of the universe written by cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, and they all said the same thing. The sky, according to these sources, was solid, not metaphorically firm in its permanence but physically solid, a structure, barrier, a ceiling that separated the world we inhabit from something else entirely. I dismissed it immediately. Of course I did. We live in an age where satellites orbit overhead, where we've sent probes beyond our solar system, where the very concept of a solid sky sounds like the superstition of people who didn't know better. But the dismissal felt reflexive rather than reasoned, and that distinction bothered me more than the claim itself, so I kept reading. Chapter 1. The Ancient Sky. The cosmology of ancient civilizations was not primitive guesswork. It was systematic, detailed, and remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. The Hebrews, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the early Greeks, indigenous cultures across the Americas and Asia, all described the sky using the same fundamental structure, a solid expanse above the earth, waters above this expanse, waters below. The heavens as something you could not pass through, only observe. The book of Genesis describes it explicitly in the creation account. On the second day, God creates a firmament to separate the waters above from the waters below. The word used in Hebrew is rakia, which translates to something beaten out, hammered flat, stretched like metal. It is described as strong, unyielding, transparent but tangible. This wasn't metaphor. The ancient cosmographers were describing what they believed to be the literal architecture of reality. I spent weeks reading through original texts, translations, scholarly commentaries. The consistency was staggering. The book of Job describes the sky as hard as a molten mirror. The Psalms refer to the firmament as strong, established, praiseworthy in its construction. The prophet Isaiah speaks of God stretching out the heavens like a curtain, spreading them like a tent to dwell in. These are not poetic flourishes, they are architectural descriptions. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, one of the oldest creation myths we have, describes Marduk creating the sky from the body of Tiamat, the primordial chaos monster. He splits her in half. One half becomes the earth, the other becomes the sky, but critically it remains a body, solid, formed, a structure that holds back the cosmic waters that existed before creation. The text is specific about this. Marduk sets guards at the sky to ensure the waters do not escape. He creates bolts and locks. He establishes watchers. The sky is not empty space. It is a constructed barrier with a specific function: containment. Egyptian cosmology operates on similar principles. Nut, the sky goddess, is depicted in tomb paintings and temple reliefs as a woman arching over the earth, her body forming the vault of heaven. Her fingertips touch the eastern horizon. Her toes touch the western horizon. Between her body and the earth, everything exists. She's not symbolic, she's structural. The Egyptian creation myth from Heliopolis describes the primordial mound rising from the waters of Nun, the infinite ocean. The sky is created as a separation, a division that creates space for life. But it is always described as something above, something that must be held up, often by the god Shu, who stands between earth and sky, arms raised, preventing collapse. This image appears everywhere in Egyptian art. The sky must be supported. It has weight. It exerts pressure. It is not void. Hindu cosmology takes the layered approach. The universe consists of multiple lokas, or realms, stacked vertically. Above the earth is the atmosphere, then various celestial realms, then the abode of the gods. Each layer is distinct, separated by boundaries. The highest realm, Brahmaloka, sits at the top, but even it is contained within a larger cosmic structure. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in existence, describes the sky as being held up by pillars. The Vishnu Purana speaks of cosmic shells, layers of reality encased one within another like nested spheres. The outermost shell is described as impenetrable, beyond which nothing exists. In China, ancient cosmology described the sky as a dome or canopy covering a square earth. The Zhoubi Suanjing, an astronomical text from around the 1st century, presents calculations based on the sun moving in a circular path above a flat plane beneath a celestial dome. The text includes mathematical formulas for predicting solar and lunar positions based on this model. These weren't religious texts, they were technical manuals. In the Americas, the pattern continues. The Hopi emergence narrative describes the people travelling upward through multiple worlds, each with its own sky ceiling. When the sky of one world became corrupt or exhausted, the people would find a sipapu, an opening, and climb through to the next level above. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems in the ancient world. They could predict eclipses centuries in advance. They tracked Venus with precision that rivals modern calculations. Their long count calendar is a mathematical achievement that still impresses scholars. And yet they describe the sky as bounded. The Maya cosmos consisted of 13 layered heavens above the earth and 9 layered underworlds below. Each level was distinct, ruled by different gods, accessible only through death or shamanic journey. The sky was not infinite. It was structured, divided, ordered. The Aztec cosmology follows similar patterns. The Codex Vaticanus depicts the universe as layers, with the earth in the middle and multiple sky levels stacked above. The highest level, Omeokon, is the dwelling place of the dual god Ometeotl, but even this supreme realm is contained within the overall structure. I started keeping a list. Every culture I examined, every ancient cosmological text, every creation myth and astronomical treatise, they all agreed. The sky is solid. The sky is bounded. The sky is a structure, not a void. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Phoenicians, the ancient Persians, the Norse with their Yggdrasil world tree holding up multiple realms, the Aboriginal Australians with their sky-world ancestors, the Polynesian navigators who mapped the stars with incredible precision but described the heavens as a dome resting on the horizon. I found myself asking, why would every major culture independently arrive at the same conclusion? The standard answer is that ancient people simply didn't know better. They looked up, saw a blue expanse that seemed solid, and assumed it was. But that explanation requires us to believe that civilizations capable of building pyramids aligned to celestial events, capable of predicting eclipses and tracking planetary movements with astonishing accuracy, were simultaneously incapable of recognizing empty space when they saw it. It didn't add up. These cultures were observational. They watched the sky obsessively. They tracked stars, planets, the moon, the sun. They created calendars so precise that we still marvel at them today. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek analog computer used to predict astronomical positions, demonstrates a level of technical sophistication that seems impossible for its era. The builders of Stonehenge aligned massive stones to solar and lunar events with precision that required generations of careful observation. The Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. The Mayan observatory at Chichen Itza tracks the equinoxes with architectural precision. These were not primitive people making wild guesses. They were careful, systematic observers of the heavens. And yet, across all of that careful observation, none of them described the sky as infinite empty space. They described a boundary. Not because they lacked imagination, but because that's what they observed, or believed they observed, or were taught to observe. The question that kept nagging at me was simpler than I wanted to admit. What if they were right? Chapter 2. The Shift in Understanding. The transformation in how humanity understood the sky did not happen gradually. It happened abruptly, during what we now call the scientific revolution, roughly between the 16th and 18th centuries. Before this period, European cosmology still followed the ancient model. The Ptolemaic system, developed by Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century, described Earth at the centre of nested crystalline spheres. Each sphere carried a celestial body: moon, sun, planets, stars. Beyond the outermost sphere lay the primum mobile, the first mover that caused all celestial motion. Beyond that, the empyrean, the dwelling place of God and the angels. This was not considered religious mythology. It was science. Ptolemy's Almagest was the authoritative astronomical text for over 1,000 years. It made predictions, it provided calculations, it worked within the observational limits of the time. The sky was the firmament, the heavens were layered spheres, and Earth sat at the centre of a bounded creation. This was not controversial. It was simply how things were understood to be. University professors taught it, navigators used it, the church endorsed it, but so did secular scholarship. Then, within the span of a few generations, everything changed. In 1543, Nicolaus Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, proposing that the Sun, not Earth, sat at the centre of the cosmos. The book was dedicated to Pope Paul III and presented as a mathematical convenience, a way to simplify calculations, not necessarily a claim about physical reality. The introduction, written by Andreas Osiander without Copernicus's knowledge, explicitly stated that the heliocentric model was merely a computational tool, not a description of how things actually were. This disclaimer allowed the book to circulate without immediate condemnation, but the idea was out, and it began to spread. In 1610, Galileo Galilei turned his telescope to the sky and observed moons orbiting Jupiter. This was significant because it proved that not everything in the heavens orbited Earth. If Jupiter had its own satellites, then the Ptolemaic model of Earth-centered spheres was incomplete at minimum, wrong at maximum. Galileo also observed the phases of Venus, which made sense in a heliocentric model, but required awkward explanations in a geocentric one. He saw mountains on the moon, proving that celestial bodies were not perfect, unchanging spheres but physical objects with terrain and features. His observations were real. His telescope showed things that were genuinely there. But the interpretation of what those observations meant, that required a leap. Johannes Kepler, working from Tycho Brahe's meticulous astronomical data, formulated 3 laws of planetary motion. Planets orbit the Sun in ellipses, not circles. They move faster when closer to the Sun. The orbital period relates to the size of the orbit through a specific mathematical ratio. These laws described planetary motion with unprecedented accuracy, but they didn't explain why planets moved this way. They were descriptive, not explanatory. Then came Isaac Newton. In 1687, Newton published Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the Principia. In it, he formulated the law of universal gravitation. Every mass attracts every other mass with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This was revolutionary not because it described new observations, but because it unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics under a single principle. The same force that makes an apple fall makes the moon orbit Earth. The heavens and Earth follow the same laws. Suddenly the sky was not a structure but a void, not a ceiling but infinite space, not a boundary but an invitation to endlessness. The crystalline spheres dissolved. The empyrean vanished. In their place, emptiness, governed by invisible forces extending forever. The shift was presented as enlightenment, as humanity finally seeing clearly after millennia of ignorance. And perhaps that's exactly what it was. But what struck me, reading through the transition documents, was how little actual proof was required for people to abandon the old model entirely. No one went up and touched the sky to confirm it wasn't solid. No one demonstrated that the ancient descriptions were physically impossible. What happened was that a new framework was proposed, one that made mathematical sense within certain assumptions, and the old framework was discarded not because it was disproven, but because it was no longer needed. Consider what actually changed. Observations of planetary motion existed before Copernicus. The same data that supported the Ptolemaic model was reinterpreted to support the Copernican model. Ptolemy could predict eclipses. So could Copernicus. Both systems worked mathematically. The choice between them was not purely empirical. It was aesthetic, philosophical. The Copernican model was simpler. It eliminated some of the complex epicycles, circles within circles that Ptolemy required. But simplicity is not proof of truth. Newton's gravity was more troubling. It worked brilliantly. It predicted the motion of celestial bodies with precision that still impresses today. But Newton himself admitted he had no idea what gravity actually was. He could describe its effects, but not its mechanism. In the Principia, he wrote, "I have not as yet been able to discover the reason for these properties of gravity from phenomena, and I do not feign hypotheses. Gravity was action at a distance, an invisible force with no physical medium. Objects attracted each other across vast emptiness without touching, without any mechanical connection. This was, philosophically, just as mysterious as crystalline, spheres, but it was useful, and utility, in the emerging scientific culture, began to matter more than explanation. The firmament didn't collapse under the weight of evidence. It was replaced by a model that served the needs of the new era. Navigation required precise planetary predictions. The Copernican model provided them. Engineering required understanding forces and motion. Newton provided that. The old cosmology, with its bounded heavens and purposeful structure, didn't fit the mechanical philosophy that was emerging. Not because it was proven false, but because it asked the wrong kinds of questions. I started to wonder, what if the ancient model wasn't wrong? What if it was simply reframed in a way that served different purposes? The question felt dangerous, not because it challenged science, but because it challenged the story we tell about progress. We are supposed to have moved from darkness into light, from superstition into knowledge, but what if we moved from one explanation into another, and both were incomplete? What if the shift from firmament to infinite space was not discovery, but decision? I kept reading. The more I learned about the scientific revolution, the more I realised how contingent it all was. Copernicus hesitated to publish, fearing ridicule. Galileo was tried by the Inquisition. Kepler spent years in poverty. Newton had a nervous breakdown and abandoned science for alchemy and theology. These were not triumphant heroes effortlessly overthrowing ignorance. They were men struggling with ideas that didn't quite fit, models that explained some things but not others, observations that could be interpreted multiple ways. And in the end, the model that won was not the one that was proven true, but the one that proved useful. Useful for what? For the emerging commercial empires that needed navigation. For the burgeoning industrial economy that needed mechanics. For the philosophical project of replacing divine purpose with material causation. The infinite universe served those purposes, the bounded firmament did not. So the firmament disappeared, not because anyone went up and proved it wasn't there, but because the new story was more convenient than the old one. Chapter 3. The Modern Firmament Theory. The modern firmament theory is not what most people imagine when they hear the phrase. It's not a claim that the sky's made of glass or crystal. It's not about a literal dome you could touch if you flew high enough. It's about Earth as a contained system. I encountered the theory through forums, video essays, independent researchers who approach cosmology from outside institutional science. The tone varies wildly. Some approach it with religious conviction, others with scientific skepticism turned inward, still others with the calm detachment of people exploring an idea simply to see where it leads. But the core claim remains consistent. Humanity lives inside a closed environment. The sky in this model is not infinite. It is bounded, not by a visible wall, but by a barrier that prevents passage beyond a certain point. Space in this framework is not a place you can travel to. It is a region, a layer of the system, but not an exit. The stars are not distant suns trillions of miles away, but lights within the system itself, fixed or moving along predetermined paths. This is not presented as fantasy. It's presented as the result of questioning assumptions that have become so fundamental we no longer recognise them as assumptions. I started cataloguing the core arguments. They fell into several categories. First, the nature of Earth itself. Modern cosmology describes Earth as a sphere rotating on its axis once every 24 hours, orbiting the Sun at approximately 67,000 miles per hour, while the entire solar system moves through the galaxy at roughly 500,000 miles per hour. Firmament theorists ask, why don't we feel this motion? The standard answer is that we're moving with the Earth, so there's no sensation of velocity. But they counter. We feel motion in airplanes, we feel motion in cars, we feel the rotation of carnival rides, yet we feel nothing from Earth's supposed rotation, orbit, or galactic movement. The response involves reference frames and constant velocity versus acceleration. Objects in constant motion don't produce sensation unless they change speed or direction. Earth's rotation is constant, so we don't feel it. But firmament researchers push back. Earth's rotation should produce measurable effects. The Coriolis effect, yes, but also more direct evidence. Long-range artillery must account for Earth's rotation in their calculations. Snipers, in theory, should need to adjust for it, yet the adjustments are minimal or absent in practice. They point to experiments. The Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887 attempted to detect Earth's motion through the luminiferous ether. It found no motion. The experiment was repeated multiple times with increasingly sophisticated equipment. Same result, no detectable motion. The standard interpretation is that this disproved the ether theory and led to special relativity. But firmament theorists suggest an alternative. Maybe the experiment detected exactly what was there, an Earth that isn't moving. Second, the nature of water. Firmament theory emphasises that water always finds its level. Oceans, lakes, rivers, they form level surfaces. Water does not curve around spheres at the scale we observe it. The standard explanation is gravity. Gravity pulls water toward the centre of Earth's mass, creating a curved surface that appears level locally but is globally spherical. Firmament theorists argue that this requires assuming what you're trying to prove. We know water is level. We observe this directly. The claim that it's actually curved relies entirely on accepting that Earth is a sphere. But if Earth is not a sphere, then water being level is exactly what we should expect. They point to large-scale observations. Looking across bodies of water, distant objects should be hidden by Earth's curvature. The formula is roughly 8 inches per mile squared. At 10 miles, an object should be hidden by approximately 67 feet of curvature. Yet there are photographs and videos showing objects visible at distances where they should be completely obscured. Buildings, mountains, islands, visible when they should be below the horizon. The standard response involves refraction, atmospheric lensing, mirages. Light bends as it passes through layers of air at different temperatures and densities, making distant objects appear higher than they actually are. But firmament researchers counter that refraction is invoked inconsistently, applied whenever observations don't match predictions but not accounted for when they do. It becomes a convenient explanation that can stretch to cover any discrepancy. Third, the nature of gravity itself. Modern physics describes gravity as a fundamental force, either as attraction between masses or as curvature of space-time caused by mass energy. Firmament theory questions whether gravity exists as described. Instead, they propose density and buoyancy as sufficient explanations for observed phenomena. Objects fall because they're denser than the medium around them. Helium balloons rise because they're less dense. No attractive force required. This seems simplistic, but they argue it's actually simpler than invoking a mysterious force that acts at infinite distance without any physical medium. Newton admitted he couldn't explain how gravity worked. Einstein reformulated it as geometry, but that doesn't explain what causes the curvature. Modern physics treats gravity as one of 4 fundamental forces, but it's the weakest and the most poorly understood. We can't unify it with quantum mechanics. We can't detect gravitational waves reliably despite building enormous interferometers. We can't explain dark matter or dark energy, except as placeholders for something that makes the math work. Firmament theorists suggest that maybe gravity is not fundamental. Maybe it's an interpretation imposed on observations that could be explained more simply if we abandon certain assumptions about Earth's shape and motion. Fourth, the nature of the sun, moon, and stars. In the firmament model, these are not what mainstream cosmology claims. The sun and moon are described as relatively local phenomena, moving above the Earth in circular or spiral paths. Their size and distance are much smaller than official figures. The stars are not distant suns, but lights of unknown nature, possibly fixed to the firmament itself or moving along predetermined paths within the enclosed system. This sounds absurd until you examine the arguments. The distance to the sun is calculated using parallax and astronomical units derived from assuming Earth's orbit. But if Earth isn't orbiting, those calculations collapse. The size of the sun is calculated from its assumed distance. Again, if the distance is wrong, the size calculation is wrong. What we actually observe is a bright disk in the sky that appears to be a certain angular size. Everything else is inference based on the heliocentric model. Firmament researchers point out that the sun and moon appear to be the same angular size, which is why we get perfect solar eclipses. In the standard model, this is an extraordinary coincidence. The sun is 400 times larger than the moon, and happens to be 400 times farther away, making them appear identical in size from Earth. In the firmament model, the sun and moon are simply local objects of similar size and distance. No coincidence required. The stars present their own puzzles. Polaris, the North Star, remains fixed in position, while all other stars rotate around it. This makes sense in a geocentric model where the sky rotates above a stationary Earth. It requires more complex explanation in a heliocentric model where Earth is rotating, orbiting, and moving through the galaxy. Star trails, long exposure photographs showing stars moving in circular arcs around Polaris, look exactly like what you'd expect if the stars were fixed to a rotating dome above a stationary Earth. Of course, they also look like what you'd expect from a rotating Earth beneath a vast distant star field. The observations don't distinguish between models, the interpretation does. Fifth, the nature of space itself. Firmament theory claims that space as commonly understood, infinite void, vacuum, filled with distant galaxies, may not exist as described. Instead, space might be a region within the enclosed system, the upper atmosphere transitioning into a different medium, possibly plasma, possibly something else. The vacuum of space might be real in the sense of low density, but not infinite, not extendable, not a place you can travel through to other planets or stars. This seems easily disprovable. After all, we've sent probes to other planets. We've landed rovers on Mars. We have photographs from throughout the solar system. But firmament theorists ask, how do you know? You've seen photographs and video. You've accepted official reports. But you haven't been there. You haven't verified it independently. You've trusted institutions to tell you the truth about what they've accomplished. And trust is not proof. This is where the theory becomes uncomfortable. It's not claiming that space agencies are lying about everything. It's suggesting that what they present as travel to distant planets might be something else. High-altitude flights, unmanned drones in the upper atmosphere, CGI enhancements, partial truths mixed with assumptions. Or it's suggesting that the probes are real, the data is real, but the interpretation is wrong. Maybe what we call Mars is not a distant planet, but something within the enclosed system, accessible at high altitude but not requiring interplanetary travel. These ideas are not presented with certainty. They're presented as possibilities that emerge when you stop assuming the standard model and start questioning what can actually be verified versus what must be accepted on authority. I realised, reading through these arguments, that firmament theory operates on a principle of radical skepticism. It trusts direct observation over expert interpretation. It trusts what you can verify over what you're told. This makes it appealing to people who distrust institutions, but it also makes it vulnerable to confirmation bias. If you decide to trust only what you can verify personally, you end up trusting very little, and in that void, alternative explanations flourish. But that doesn't mean the questions are invalid. The firmament theory survives not because people are ignorant, but because it asks questions that institutional science treats as settled beyond inquiry. And when questions are declared off limits, the very act of asking them becomes suspicious, which raises its own question. Why is questioning cosmology treated as more suspect than questioning politics, economics, or any other field where human interpretation plays a role? The answer might be that cosmology is foundational. If the shape of Earth and the nature of the sky are wrong, then everything built on those assumptions becomes questionable. The entire structure of modern knowledge rests on a few key premises about the physical world, and if those premises are challenged successfully, the structure falls. Maybe that's why the firmament theory persists, not because it's true, but because it's dangerous. And dangerous ideas, whether right or wrong, never truly die. They wait, dormant, until conditions allow them to resurface. I kept reading, uncertain whether I was approaching truth or falling into delusion. The line between them, I was beginning to realise, was thinner than I'd believed. Chapter 4. The Space Barrier. One of the most persistent claims within firmament research involves rocket launches and satellite footage. Specifically, the behaviour of objects as they ascend into the upper atmosphere and beyond. I started watching launch videos with a level of attention I'd never applied before. Not passively accepting what I saw, but actually observing, frame by frame in some cases. Firmament researchers point to videos of rocket launches, particularly those with onboard cameras that track the ascent. They claim that at a certain altitude, rockets do not continue straight up. Instead, trajectories curve, sharply and consistently, as if following the contour of something above. I watched a SpaceX Falcon launch from Cape Canaveral. The initial ascent is vertical, the rocket climbing straight up through the lower atmosphere. But around the time it passes through the densest cloud layers, somewhere between 40 and 60,000 feet, the trajectory begins to arc. Gradually at first, then more pronounced. The official explanation is orbital mechanics. Rockets curve because they are entering orbit, which requires horizontal velocity, not just vertical ascent. To orbit Earth, an object must move sideways fast enough that its fall toward Earth is balanced by its forward motion. This requires building up tremendous horizontal speed. The trajectory makes perfect sense within the framework of a spherical Earth in infinite space. You don't go straight up because straight up leads nowhere useful. You curve to build orbital velocity. But firmament researchers argue that the curve is too consistent, too pronounced, too early in the ascent to be explained purely by orbital insertion. They suggest that rockets curve because they encounter a boundary, and the only way to remain aloft is to follow that boundary, rather than attempting to penetrate it. I watched more launches: Russian Soyuz, Chinese Long March, European Ariane, Indian PSLV. Every launch, regardless of the agency or the stated mission, followed the same pattern. Vertical ascent, then curve, then horizontal acceleration. Is this evidence of a barrier, or is it simply how orbital mechanics work? The answer depends entirely on which model you start with. I looked for videos of rockets attempting purely vertical flights, missiles designed to go straight up rather than achieve orbit. The footage was harder to find, but it existed. high-altitude research rockets, ballistic missile tests. These also curved, though their paths were different from orbital launches. Firmament theorists point out that no rocket maintains a purely vertical trajectory beyond a certain altitude. They all curve, they all level off, they all behave as if following the inside surface of a dome. But orbital mechanics requires curves. Missiles follow ballistic arcs governed by their velocity and angle of launch. The observations don't distinguish between models without already assuming one. Then there's the footage itself, or rather the lack of certain kinds of footage. Firmament theorists ask, why is there no unedited, continuous video of a rocket or probe leaving Earth's atmosphere and travelling into deep space? Every transition from Earth to space involves cuts, edits, camera switches. We see the launch, we see orbit, we see images from space, but we never see the journey between in real time. I searched extensively. I found promotional videos, compilation reels, documentary footage. NASA's archive contains thousands of hours of material. SpaceX live streams launches regularly. The International Space Station broadcasts continuously. But an uncut video showing the continuous transition from ground level to orbital altitude, I couldn't find one. The standard answer is practicality. Rockets travel too fast for continuous tracking from a single camera. Distances are too vast for real-time transmission. Without compression, continuous footage would be boring. Minutes of empty sky followed by the rocket becoming a tiny dot. These explanations make sense, but the absence is noted, catalogued, treated as suspicious by Firmament researchers. I kept searching. I found onboard camera footage from various launches. Typically the video shows the rocket ascending, clouds falling away, the sky darkening to black, and then cut, switch to external view, or switch to animation explaining what's happening. When continuous onboard footage exists, it often shows strange things. Fisheye lenses creating horizon curves that shift and bend unnaturally. The Earth appearing convex in one frame, concave in another, depending on camera position and lens distortion. Firmament researchers catalogue these distortions obsessively. They claim that the curved horizon we see in space footage is an artifact of wide-angle lenses, not evidence of Earth's spherical shape. They show comparison videos, demonstrating how fisheye lenses can make flat surfaces appear curved. The space agencies acknowledge that wide-angle lenses are used. They're necessary to capture the full view in cramped spaces, but they argue that the curvature of Earth is visible even in footage shot with minimal distortion. Firmament researchers counter by asking for raw footage straight from the camera before processing. They want access to original files, metadata intact, showing exactly what cameras captured before any enhancement or correction. This raw footage is rarely available to the public. When it is released, it often comes after processing for color correction, stabilization, or format conversion. The original data exists in proprietary formats, archived by space agencies, not accessible for independent verification. Is this evidence of deception, or is it simply how institutions handle technical data? I started noticing patterns in how launches were broadcast. Live streams from SpaceX would show the rocket ascending, then switch to animation as it climbed beyond visual range. When the feed returned to live footage, the rocket was already in space, or the payload was being deployed, or the booster was descending for landing. The critical moments, the actual passage from atmosphere to space, were consistently absent from direct coverage. Firmament theorists point to specific anomalies, videos showing objects appearing to hit an invisible ceiling, bubbles in space footage, suggesting underwater filming, harnesses visible on astronauts during supposedly zero-gravity demonstrations, green screens detected in background analysis of ISS broadcasts. Each anomaly has official explanations. Bubbles are condensation or ice particles. Harnesses are equipment tethers for safety. Green screens are used for educational demonstrations, not actual space footage. The ceiling effect is debris separation or stage jettison captured at angles that create optical illusions. I examined the evidence. Some of it was clearly misidentified. A reflection mistaken for a bubble. Camera artifacts mistaken for green screen edges. Perspective tricks making straight lines appear to curve. but some of it was harder to dismiss. Videos where the physics seemed wrong. Objects moving in ways that didn't match the zero-gravity environment they were supposed to be in. Footage where astronauts appeared to be supported by invisible wires, their movements constrained in ways that suggested harnesses rather than free-floating. The most troubling aspect wasn't any single piece of evidence. It was the cumulative weight of anomalies, each individually explainable, but collectively suggesting something off. Or it was confirmation bias, seeing what you want to see, finding patterns in noise. I couldn't prove it was suspicious, but I also couldn't dismiss the observations entirely. What bothered me most was the realization that I had never questioned it before. I had simply accepted that space travel looked a certain way because that's how it was presented. But presentation is not proof. In the absence of certain types of evidence, unedited continuous footage, publicly available raw data, transparent access to verification, that absence might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. The firmament theory doesn't require vast conspiracy. It only requires institutional interpretation of data that we can't personally verify. And in the gap between what we're shown and what we can confirm, alternative explanations find room to breathe. Chapter 5. The Silence Above. One of the quieter elements of the firmament theory involves a simple question. What does it look like to leave Earth? Not from Earth, not looking back at Earth, but leaving. The act of passage from inside the atmosphere to outside it, uninterrupted, unmediated. I searched for this footage with genuine curiosity. I wanted to see what it looked like when a camera mounted on a rocket or satellite transitioned from sky to space, the moment when blue gives way to black, when atmosphere ends and void begins. I found compilations, edited sequences, animations, artist renderings. I found footage from the International Space Station, showing Earth from orbit. I found re-entry videos showing the fiery descent back through the atmosphere. I found promotional material from space agencies, beautiful and inspiring, but I did not find unedited, continuous footage of the crossing itself. This absence is not proof of anything. It could be explained a dozen different ways, all of them mundane. Technical limitations, bandwidth constraints, editorial choices for public consumption. The sheer duration of ascent making continuous coverage impractical. But it is an absence, and firmament researchers treat absences as data. The theory suggests that the firmament does not need to be hidden if no one is looking for it. If the assumption is that space is infinite and accessible, then the lack of direct evidence for crossing into it becomes invisible. We see what we expect to see, and we explain away everything else. This idea troubled me more than I wanted to admit. How much of what I believed about the world came from direct experience versus mediated information? I had never been to space. I had never seen Earth from orbit with my own eyes. I had never witnessed a rocket launch in person, let alone tracked its entire ascent beyond the limits of visibility. Everything I knew about space came from images, videos, reports, textbooks, authorities. I trusted those sources. Of course I did. They came from institutions with resources, expertise, decades of accumulated knowledge. NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, SpaceX. These organizations employed thousands of scientists and engineers. They had budgets in the billions. They produced tangible results, satellites that provided GPS, communications, weather forecasting. But trust is not verification. And verification, in the modern world, has become almost impossible for individuals. I started thinking about how knowledge works in a technological society. Most of what we know second-hand. We read it in books written by experts. We see it on screen showing footage from places we'll never visit. We accept it as true because rejecting it would require rejecting the entire edifice of specialised knowledge that makes modern life function. This is not inherently wrong. Specialisation is necessary. No single person can verify everything. We rely on institutions, peer review, reputation, consensus. But what happens when those institutions have interest beyond truth? When they serve political, economic or ideological purposes? Space exploration, from its inception, was entangled with Cold War politics. The space race was not about science. It was about demonstrating technological superiority, projecting power, claiming ideological victory. Sputnik terrified the United States not because it was dangerous, but because it symbolized Soviet capability. The Apollo program was a response to that terror. Kennedy's speech about going to the moon was not a scientific proclamation. It was a strategic decision. We choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it serves national interest. Firmament researchers point to this history and ask, if space exploration began as propaganda, how much of it remains propaganda? They note that the most iconic images of space exploration, the Apollo moon landing, Earthrise, the blue marble photograph, all emerged during the height of the Cold War. All were produced by a government with massive incentive to demonstrate superiority. All have been questioned, analysed, scrutinised for anomalies. The moon landing deniers have their own extensive literature, their own claimed evidence of staged footage, impossible shadows, missing stars. I was not researching moon landing conspiracies specifically, but the methodologies overlapped. Question official, narratives, examine footage for inconsistencies, demand primary sources. The firmament theory doesn't necessarily deny that Apollo happened. It questions what Apollo actually accomplished. Maybe astronauts went up. Maybe they orbited in high altitude. Maybe they landed somewhere. But did they land on a rock orbiting Earth at 250,000 miles away? Or did they land on something within the enclosed system, something we call the moon but misunderstand fundamentally? These questions feel absurd, but absurdity is not refutation. I kept returning to the central problem. Everything I knew about space came through mediation. Cameras, computers, institutions, interpreters. I had no direct access to the phenomena itself. When I look at the moon through a telescope, I see a bright disk with visible features, craters, Maria, highlands, beautiful and detailed. But I'm seeing reflected sunlight, filtered through atmosphere, focused through glass. I'm not seeing the moon as it is. I'm seeing an optical representation. When I see footage from the ISS, I'm seeing compressed video transmitted from orbit, processed through multiple systems, displayed on a screen. The astronauts floating in zero gravity might be exactly what they appear to be. Or they might be in a high-altitude aircraft in parabolic flight. Or they might be in a carefully constructed set with hidden supports. I couldn't tell the difference from the footage alone. This is the epistemological problem at the heart of the firmament theory. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, an unprecedented distance from primary experience. We can see more than any previous generation but verify less. The firmament might exist or might not, but our relationship to truth has become so mediated that certainty is elusive regardless. Firmament researchers exploit this uncertainty. They ask questions designed to reveal how little we actually know versus how much we accept on authority. Have you personally measured the distance to the sun? Have you calculated Earth's circumference independently? Have you verified that satellites exist in the orbits claimed? Have you confirmed that the laws of physics operate the same everywhere in the universe? The answer to all of these is no for nearly everyone. We accept these things because experts tell us they're true, and most of the time, that's sufficient. The GPS on my phone works. Weather satellites provide accurate forecasts. The ISS is visible passing overhead on clear nights. But working doesn't prove the explanation. A geocentric model with complex epicycles also worked within its limits. Ptolemy's calculations produced accurate predictions for centuries. The model was useful without being true. Maybe our current model is the same. Useful, predictive, explanatory within certain bounds, but fundamentally wrong about the underlying structure of reality. The firmament theory suggests that we are not lied to so much as given interpretations that serve institutional purposes. The data might be real, the interpretation might be convenient, and in a world where direct verification is impossible, convenience can masquerade as truth indefinitely. Chapter 6. Antarctica and the Edge. Antarctica appears in almost every firmament discussion, often as the single most important piece of evidence for the theory. The claim is straightforward. Antarctica is not just a continent, it is a boundary. Not the southern edge of a spherical Earth, but the outer edge of the known world, encircling everything else. In the Firmament model, Antarctica functions as a perimeter, a wall of ice that surrounds the oceans and continents, marking the limit of the enclosed system. Beyond Antarctica, if the theory is correct, lies nothing, or something unknowable, or the edge of the firmament itself. This idea is not new. Before modern exploration, Antarctica existed in European imagination as Terra Australis Incognita, unknown, southern land. Medieval and Renaissance maps sometimes depicted it as a vast ring encircling the known continents, a counterbalance to the landmasses of the north. These maps were speculative. Cartographers included Terra Australis not from observation but from theory. They believed the world needed symmetry, that northern lands required southern equivalents to maintain balance, so they drew Antarctica before anyone had seen it. When actual exploration began in the 18th and 19th centuries, the picture that emerged was complicated. Captain James Cook circumnavigated Antarctica between 1772 and 1775, becoming the first explorer to cross the Antarctic Circle. But he never saw the mainland. He encountered impenetrable ice barriers that prevented further south penetration. He sailed along the ice edge for thousands of miles, mapping its extent but never confirming what lay beyond. Cook's journals described the ice barrier as seemingly endless. He would sail parallel to it for days, weeks, always finding more ice, never finding passage. He concluded that if land existed beyond the ice, it was unreachable and uninhabitable. Firmament researchers point to Cook's voyage as evidence. He didn't circumnavigate a continent, he circumnavigated the ice barrier that surrounds the known world. The distance he travelled, over 60,000 miles, is far greater than the circumference of Antarctica as currently mapped. The official explanation is that Cook didn't sail in a tight circle around the continent. He meandered, followed ice flows, retreated and advanced based on conditions. His path was irregular, not a direct circumference, but the raw distance travelled remained striking. Later expeditions claim to have discovered and mapped the Antarctic mainland, but Firmament researchers question these claims. They note that Antarctica is the least mapped, least verified continent. Most of its interior is inaccessible. What we call accurate maps are largely based on aerial surveys, satellite imagery, and ice-penetrating radar, all subject to interpretation. No one has walked across Antarctica following a route that would definitively confirm its shape. The few transcontinental expeditions followed predetermined paths, usually seeking the South Pole, not attempting to map the entire coastline or verify the overall structure. And then there's the Antarctic Treaty. Signed in Washington in December 1959, the Antarctic Treaty designated Antarctica as a scientific preserve. It banned military activity, prohibited mineral mining, suspended territorial claims, and established international cooperation in research. On its face, the treaty seems reasonable. Antarctica is harsh, remote, environmentally sensitive. International protection makes sense. But firmament theorists see something else. They note that the treaty was signed during the Cold War, a period when the United States and Soviet Union agreed on almost nothing. Yet both nations, along with 10 others, immediately signed a binding agreement about Antarctica. Why? What made Antarctica so important that ideological enemies found common ground there? The treaty's provisions are extensive. Article 1 prohibits any military activity. Article 7 allows any signatory nation to inspect any other nation's Antarctic stations at any time. Article 9 establishes regular consultative meetings to discuss Antarctic governance. But the most interesting provision is the implicit one. All territorial claims are frozen. 7 nations had claimed portions of Antarctica before the treaty. The treaty doesn't resolve these claims. It suspends them indefinitely. No new claims can be made. Existing claims cannot be enforced or expanded. Firmament researchers ask, why freeze territorial claims on a frozen wasteland? If Antarctica is just ice and rock with no strategic value, why bother with complex international governance? The official answer involves science and environmental protection. Antarctica is pristine, valuable for research, vulnerable to exploitation, the treaty preserves it for peaceful study. But firmament theorists suggest the treaty serves another purpose: controlling access. By making Antarctica an international preserve, no single nation can claim it, but also no independent expedition can explore it freely. I investigated this claim. I found that visiting Antarctica is indeed difficult. Tourism exists, but it's heavily regulated. Tour operators must follow strict protocols established by the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators. Landing sites are limited, activities are restricted. Independent travel is essentially impossible without permits, approvals, and enormous expense. Private expeditions to Antarctica's interior require permission from multiple governments, logistical support from approved contractors, insurance, emergency extraction plans. The barriers are not legal prohibitions, but practical impossibilities. You can visit Antarctica as a tourist, but you'll see what tour operators show you. You can conduct research there, but you'll work within established stations under treaty oversight. You cannot simply charter a boat, sail south, and explore independently. Firmament researchers catalogue stories of people who tried, adventurers who planned Antarctic expeditions and faced bureaucratic roadblocks, researchers whose projects were denied permits for vague reasons, filmmakers who requested access to interior regions and were told no. Are these restrictions about environmental protection, or about preventing discovery of something that contradicts official narratives? I found one account particularly compelling. A private explorer claimed he wanted to sail along Antarctica's coast, filming continuously, creating a full video record of the entire perimeter. His stated goal was to verify Antarctica's shape and size independently. Never got approval. Authorities cited safety concerns, environmental regulations, lack of proper insurance. He tried multiple times over several years, adjusting his plans to meet objections. Each time new barriers appeared. Eventually he gave up. His account, posted in various forums, reads like someone defeated by bureaucracy rather than physical impossibility. The message: you can't go there because we won't let you. Is this evidence of conspiracy? Or is it simply how institutions manage risk and protect sensitive environments? I couldn't answer definitively, but the pattern was there. Antarctica is unique in being both accessible in theory and restricted in practice. You can go, but only under conditions that ensure you see what you're supposed to see. Firmament theory suggests that if Antarctica is the edge, the perimeter wall of the enclosed world, then it must be protected not by force but by procedure. Make it legal to visit but impractical to explore. Allow research but control where researchers go. Permit tourism but limit what tourists can access. This is conspiracy theory methodology, finding sinister purpose in bureaucratic complexity. But it's also worth noting that Antarctic governance is genuinely unusual. No other landmass is subject to such comprehensive international control. No other region is simultaneously claimed by multiple nations and governed by none. The firmament theory asks, what is Antarctica hiding? And the unsettling answer might be the fact that it's not hiding anything. It's openly there, surrounding everything, and we're just not allowed to look closely enough to realise it. I looked at maps of Antarctica. The official ones show a roughly circular continent centred on the South Pole. The firmament model depicts it as a ring around the outer edge of a flat plain. Both maps use the same data points, the same coastline observations, the same ice formations, but they project that data onto fundamentally different shapes. One assumes a sphere, one assumes a plane, and from where we stand looking at paper or screens, we cannot tell which projection is true. Chapter 7. Control through cosmology. The firmament theory expands beyond questions of physics. It becomes, at its deepest level, a theory about purpose. If Earth is a ball spinning through infinite space, then humanity is a cosmic accident. We are the product of random processes, isolated in a vast and indifferent universe. There is no centre. There is no purpose. There is only the cold mathematics of matter and energy. This is not incidental to modern cosmology. It is foundational. I started reading the history of how scientific cosmology displaced religious cosmology. The shift from geocentrism to heliocentrism is often presented as purely scientific. Better observations, better mathematics, better explanation. But the philosophical implications were just as significant as the technical ones. The geocentric model placed humanity at the centre of creation. Not the physical centre necessarily, but the focal point. Everything revolved around Earth. The heavens moved for us to observe. The sun existed to give us light and warmth. The stars marked time and season for our benefit. This was not vanity. It was coherence. If God created the universe, and creation had a purpose, then humanity's position at the centre made theological sense. We were the purpose. The cosmos existed in relation to us. The heliocentric model shattered that coherence. Suddenly Earth was just another planet, orbiting just another star in just another galaxy among billions. We were not central. We were peripheral, cosmically insignificant. Copernicus understood this. That's why he hesitated to publish. He knew the implications extended beyond astronomy into theology. If Earth is not the centre, then what is humanity's relationship to the divine? Giordano Bruno took the next step. He proposed that the universe was infinite, filled with countless stars and planets, possibly harbouring other life. He was burned at the stake in 1600, officially for heresy, but the specific heresy was cosmological, denying the uniqueness of Earth and humanity. The Church resisted heliocentrism not because of stubbornness, but because they understood what was at stake. If the cosmos has no centre, then it has no hierarchy. If it has no hierarchy, then it has no order imposed by divine will. If there is no divine order, then there is no transcendent meaning. Modern secular thinkers celebrate this as liberation from superstition. We don't need cosmic purpose. We create our own meaning. We are free from the burden of predetermined significance. But firmament theorists ask, what if that freedom is actually loss? If Earth is enclosed, if we live inside a created system with boundaries and structure, then everything changes. We are not random. We are placed. We are contained. We are perhaps observed. Purpose becomes possible. Again, not as human construction, but as cosmic fact. The psychological implications are profound. An infinite universe invites nihilism. A bounded creation invites meaning. And meaning, whether comforting or terrifying, changes how people live. I found myself thinking about Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation, God is dead. He didn't mean this literally. He meant that modernity had made God unnecessary. The infinite mechanical universe explained itself without divine intervention. Humanity no longer needed theology to understand the cosmos. But Nietzsche also understood the consequences. If God is dead, if cosmic purpose disappears, then we face the abyss of meaninglessness. The death of God was not victory, but crisis. We killed God, Nietzsche wrote, and now we must become gods ourselves to be worthy of the deed. Modern culture has not become godlike. It has become fractured, anxious, searching desperately for meaning in a universe that offers none. Depression, suicide, addiction, despair. These are not just personal failures, but existential responses to cosmic insignificance. Firmament researchers argue that this is intentional, not that specific individuals conspired to make people miserable, but that the shift from bounded creation to infinite void served powerful interests. If humanity has no cosmic purpose, then purpose becomes whatever authorities define it as: work, consumption, national service, ideological commitment. These fill the void left by transcendent meaning. People without cosmic significance are easier to control because they must find significance somewhere, and institutions are happy to provide it. This sounds paranoid, but it's also historically demonstrable. The rise of totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century coincided with the full internalization of cosmic meaninglessness. Fascism, communism, various nationalisms all offered collective purpose to replace lost cosmic purpose. Even liberal democracy, with its emphasis on individual freedom and material prosperity, functions as a substitute meaning system. We are free to pursue happiness, which in practice means pursuing wealth, status, pleasure. These are not nothing. but they are not cosmic significance either. The firmament theory suggests that cosmology is not neutral. How we understand the sky shapes how we understand ourselves. An infinite void produces one kind of human. A bounded creation produces another. I thought about medieval Europe, often dismissed as superstitious and backward. But medieval people lived in a cosmos saturated with meaning. Every star was an angel. Every planet had divine significance. The heavens declared the glory of God. Life was hard, often brutal, but it was not meaningless. Modern people live in comfort unimaginable to medieval peasants. We have technology, medicine, leisure, but we also have epidemic rates of depression, a mental health crisis that shows no signs of abating despite increasing access to treatment. Could this crisis be cosmological? Could the loss of a meaningful universe create psychological damage that no amount of therapy or medication can fully address? Firmament theorists believe so. They argue that returning to a bounded cosmos, re-establishing Earth as a created place rather than a cosmic accident, could restore meaning not as belief, but as fact. This is where the theory becomes most controversial, because if the firmament exists, then someone created it. And if someone created it, then we must ask why, and what they want from us, and what happens if we ignore their purposes. These are theological questions masquerading as cosmological ones. Science is not equipped to answer them. Science deals with mechanism, not meaning. It can tell us how things work, but not why they exist or what we should do about it. The firmament theory reintroduces purpose as a scientific question. If Earth is enclosed, that enclosure was deliberate, the system was designed. And design implies designer, which implies intent, which implies meaning. Modern science fled from this centuries ago, not because design was disproven, but because methodologically limiting science to mechanism made it more productive. You can study how planets orbit without asking why planets exist. You can understand gravity without understanding purpose, but the limitation was methodological, not metaphysical. Science chose not to ask certain questions, not because they were invalid, but because they were outside its scope. Firmament theory asks those questions again, not through theology, but through cosmology. It treats the structure of the universe as evidence for purpose, and purpose as evidence for structure. This circularity is intentional. If you start from materialism, the assumption that only matter and energy exist, then purpose is illusion. But if you start from purpose, the assumption that existence has meaning, then materialism is incomplete. The choice between these starting points is not scientific, it's philosophical. And philosophy, unlike science, does not settle questions through experiment. It settles them through commitment. Modern culture committed to materialism, not because it was proven true, but because it was useful. It enabled technological progress, economic growth, social engineering. It made the world predictable, controllable, exploitable. But it also made the world empty, and emptiness, no matter how comfortable, eventually becomes unbearable. The firmament theory offers an alternative, not a return to medieval superstition, but a reframing of modern knowledge. Keep the observations, change the interpretation, recognise that the infinite void might be a choice rather than a discovery. And if it's a choice, we can choose differently. Chapter 8. The Psychological Barrier. The strongest argument against the firmament theory is not scientific, it's psychological. The idea of a solid sky feels impossible, not unlikely, not improbable, impossible in a way that bypasses reason and settles directly into instinct. We have internalized the infinite universe so completely that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. It's not that we've examined the evidence and found the firmament lacking. It's that the firmament violates the shape of the world as we've been taught to imagine it. And that, firmament researchers argue, is exactly how the system works. I started paying attention to my own reactions as I researched. Every time I encountered a firmament claim that felt compelling, I noticed a reflex, a voice in my head that said, "This can't be true." Not "this doesn't seem true," or "I need more evidence." Simply, "This can't be true." That reaction was automatic, instantaneous, occurring before any conscious evaluation of the claim itself. I recognised it as cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that occurs when new information contradicts existing beliefs. Human. Mine resist this discomfort. We have multiple strategies for reducing it: rejecting the new information, reinterpreting it to fit existing beliefs, or creating rationalizations that allow both to coexist. What we rarely do is actually change the foundational belief, because foundational beliefs are integrated into our entire understanding of reality. Changing them means rebuilding from scratch. The firmament theory, if true, would require exactly that kind of rebuilding. Everything I learned about the universe, from elementary school through university, would need to be re-examined. Not just astronomy, but physics, geology, history, philosophy. The entire edifice of modern knowledge rests on certain cosmological assumptions. If those assumptions are wrong, the edifice doesn't just modify, it collapses. This is terrifying. Not intellectually terrifying, but existentially so. It means that the authorities I trusted were wrong. The institutions that educated me failed. The consensus. Reality I share with billions of people is mistaken. More than mistaken, constructed. Built deliberately to produce a certain kind of understanding, a certain kind of human being. I found myself thinking about education, how we learn about the universe from childhood. Picture books showing the solar system, the planets orbiting the sun, Earth as a blue marble floating in black void. These images are presented as photographs, as direct representation of reality. But they're not. They're artist renderings, composites, CGI reconstructions based on data interpreted through models. The photograph of Earth from space that hangs in classrooms is usually a composite of multiple images stitched together and colour corrected for visual appeal. Nothing wrong with that inherently, but we're not told it's a composite. We're shown it as truth, and we internalise it as truth, and by the time we're old enough to question, the belief is so fundamental that questioning feels absurd. This is social conditioning. Not in the sinister sense of deliberate brainwashing, but in the mundane sense of how cultures transmit worldviews. Every society teaches its children a cosmology. Medieval Europe taught bounded heavens and divine hierarchy. Ancient Egypt taught the sky goddess Nut arching over the earth. Modern society teaches infinite space and cosmic insignificance. None of these cosmologies is self-evident. All require teaching, reinforcement, correction, when children's natural observations differ from approved understanding. I remembered being told as a child that the earth was round. I looked at the horizon, it appeared flat. I was told this was because the earth is very large and I was very small. The curvature exists but is imperceptible at ground level. I accepted this explanation. What choice did I have? Every adult, every teacher, every book agreed. Doubting would have meant doubting everything, isolating myself from consensus reality. So I learned to trust authority over observation. I learned that what appears true might be false, and what appears false might be true, and the way to navigate this is to trust experts. This is not unreasonable. Experts exist for good reason. Specialization is necessary, but it creates dependence. And dependence creates vulnerability to deception, whether intentional or accidental. Firmament theory survives because it identifies this vulnerability and exploits it. It asks, what if the experts are wrong? Not about everything, but about this one foundational thing. The resistance to that question is not rational. It's defensive. It's the mind protecting itself from chaos. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon. When people's worldviews are threatened, they don't respond with careful evaluation of evidence. They respond with increased commitment to existing beliefs, dismissal of contradictory information, and hostility towards sources of threat. This is called worldview defense. It's not conscious, it's automatic. And it operates below the level where reason can intervene. Firmament theorists understand this. That's why they frame their arguments carefully. They don't lead with, the earth is flat, because that triggers immediate rejection. Instead, they ask questions. They point to anomalies. They invite curiosity rather than demanding belief. The method is Socratic. undermine certainty gradually, create doubt, show that what seems obvious might be assumption. Demonstrate that accepted answers don't fully address underlying questions. This works on some people, those who already harbour doubts about authority, who feel alienated from mainstream consensus, who sense that something in the official narrative doesn't fit their experience. For them, the firmament theory is not absurd, it's liberating. It validates their suspicion that they've been lied to, manipulated, controlled. But it also creates new certainties just as rigid as the old ones. Firmament believers often become as dogmatic as the scientific materialists they oppose. They dismiss counter-arguments reflexively. They interpret every piece of evidence as confirmation. They retreat into echo chambers where their beliefs are never seriously challenged. This is the trap of conspiracy thinking. It begins with legitimate questions but ends with unfalsifiable worldviews. If all evidence against your theory can be explained as part of the conspiracy, then your theory becomes immune to disproof. The firmament theory walks this line. At its best, it's genuine inquiry into cosmological assumptions. At its worst, it's paranoid fantasy that sees deception everywhere. I tried to stay on the inquiry side, to ask questions without committing to answers, to examine evidence without deciding prematurely what it meant. But I felt the pull, the attraction of having an explanation that accounts for everything. The comfort of knowing or believing I know what others miss. This is the psychological allure of conspiracy theories generally. They promise hidden knowledge, special insight, the power of seeing through illusion. They elevate the believer above the deceived masses. This is ego gratification masquerading as truth-seeking, and it's dangerous because it feels like enlightenment. The firmament theory specifically offers something unique. It's not just about governments lying or corporations corrupting. It's about the fundamental nature of reality being other than we've been told. If true, it means we live in a creation, not an accident. We have purpose, not randomness. We are observed, not isolated. These are comforting ideas for people who find modern cosmology existentially devastating. The firmament offers meaning, structure, cosmic significance. But comfort is not truth, and the desire for meaning can override critical thinking just as easily as fear or anger can. I had to keep reminding myself, the fact that I want something to be true doesn't make it true. The fact that believing something would be psychologically beneficial doesn't make it correct. Truth is independent of preference. Reality doesn't care what we need it to be, but we care, and that caring shapes what we're willing to consider, what we're able to see, what we can accept. The psychological barrier to the firmament theory is not that it's too absurd to believe, it's that accepting it requires surrendering too much. The comfort of consensus, the trust in institutions, the shared reality that makes communication possible. These are not small things to surrender, and most people won't. Not because they've examined the evidence and found it lacking, but because the cost of belief is too high. The firmament theory survives on the margins, among people for whom the cost of disbelief has become higher than the cost of belief. People who have already lost trust, already feel alienated, already suspect that consensus reality is constructed rather than discovered. For them, the firmament is not absurdity, it's the truth that makes sense of everything else that doesn't. Chapter 9. The Cracks in the Sky. There are stories, scattered and unverified, of anomalies in the upper atmosphere. I started collecting them the way firmament researchers do, not with the assumption that they prove anything, but with the recognition that patterns emerge from accumulation. Strange sounds recorded by high-altitude balloons, hums and vibrations that don't correspond to known atmospheric phenomena. The frequency ranges are wrong for wind, too regular for turbulence, too persistent for equipment malfunction. I found a research paper from a team that launched weather balloons equipped with acoustic sensors. At altitudes above 100,000 feet, the sensors detected sounds described as humming or rumbling. The sounds occurred consistently at similar altitudes across multiple launches. The researchers noted them in their data but had no explanation. Atmospheric pressure at that height is too low for conventional sound propagation. Yet the sensors recorded something. The paper was published in a minor journal. I found no follow-up studies. The phenomenon was noted and abandoned, filed under unexplained and forgotten. Firmament researchers catalogue this as evidence of the barrier. They suggest the sounds are the firmament resonating, vibrating, responding to pressure from below or forces from beyond. Is that what it is? Or is it electromagnetic interference misinterpreted as sound? Or some atmospheric effect science hasn't yet explained? I couldn't know, but the sounds were recorded. That much was verifiable. Then there are the lights. Unexplained light patterns observed by pilots and astronomers. Not auroras, which are well understood. Not meteors or satellites or conventional aircraft. Something else. I read accounts from commercial pilots describing flashes above the cloud layer. Brief, intense, blue-white light that illuminates the sky at altitudes where nothing should be. The flashes don't fall like meteors. They don't move like aircraft. They appear, pulse, and vanish. One pilot described seeing these lights during a transoceanic flight. He reported them to air traffic control. They had no explanation. Other aircraft in the area saw nothing. His cockpit instruments showed no anomalies, but the lights were there, he insisted, visible for perhaps 5 or 10 seconds before disappearing. He filed a report. Aviation authorities investigated. No explanation was found. The incident was classified as unexplained atmospheric phenomenon and closed. Firmament theorists point to these reports as glimpses of the barrier. They suggest the lights are energy discharges where objects, meteors, space debris or something else, strike the firmament and disperse. In conventional cosmology, these lights might be sprites or elves, upper atmospheric electrical phenomena associated with thunderstorms, but the sightings firmament researchers catalogue occur in clear conditions without nearby storms, at altitudes higher than where sprites typically form. Again, unexplained, not proof. But the accumulation is notable. There are also reports from people who claim to have witnessed objects appearing to stop at a certain altitude. Rockets, high-altitude aircraft, even meteorites that seem to strike something invisible and bounce or disintegrate. One account described a rocket launched from a private facility, designed to reach extreme altitude. The launch was filmed. In the footage, the rocket ascends normally until it reaches approximately 300,000 feet. Then it appears to hit something. The trajectory changes abruptly. The rocket tumbles, breaks apart, and falls. The official explanation was structural failure due to atmospheric stress, but the failure occurred at an altitude where atmospheric pressure is negligible, and the change in trajectory was sudden, as if encountering resistance rather than failing from internal stress. Firmament researchers analysed the footage frame by frame. They claim the rocket didn't break from stress. It hit something solid, invisible, and shattered on impact. Could they be right? Or are they seeing what they want to see in ambiguous footage? I watched the video multiple times. The rocket does change trajectory suddenly. The breakup is rapid, but rockets are complex machines operating at extreme conditions. Failure can be sudden without requiring invisible barriers. Still, the footage is unsettling. Something happened at that altitude. Whether it was structural failure or impact with a boundary depends on assumptions I couldn't verify. Beyond these specific incidents, there's a broader pattern that firmament researchers find meaningful: the lack of high-altitude phenomena. We know a great deal about the troposphere, where weather occurs. We know somewhat less about the stratosphere, where aircraft fly. But beyond that, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere, our knowledge becomes increasingly indirect, based on instruments, models, extrapolation. Firmament theorists ask, why are there no continuous observation stations in the upper atmosphere? Why do we rely on brief rocket flights and satellite data rather than permanent platforms? The official answer is engineering difficulty. Maintaining structures at extreme altitude is harder than orbiting satellites. The environment is hostile. Cost-benefit doesn't justify it, but the absence is noted. We have submarines in the deep ocean. We have stations in Antarctica. We have the ISS in space, but nothing in that transitional zone between atmosphere and void. Firmament researchers suggest this is intentional. If the firmament exists somewhere in the upper atmosphere, permanent observation platforms would detect it. Better to keep that region accessible only through brief controlled visits. Is this paranoid, or is it pattern recognition? I thought about how much of our cosmological understanding depends on that inaccessible zone. We can't go there personally. We can't station observers there. We must trust instruments, briefly deployed, reporting data that's interpreted through models we can't independently verify. The gap between what we observe directly and what we believe exists is enormous, and in that gap, uncertainty breeds alternative explanations. I found one account particularly compelling not because it proved anything, but because it illustrated the epistemological problem. An amateur group built a high-altitude balloon platform. They equipped it with cameras, sensors, GPS tracking. Their goal was to document the ascent from ground to maximum altitude continuously. The balloon launched successfully. It ascended normally. At around 120,000 feet, telemetry became erratic. GPS showed the balloon's position jumping impossibly. Cameras recorded distorted images as if passing through some kind of interference. Then, at approximately 130,000 feet, all systems failed simultaneously. No gradual degradation, instant loss of signal. The balloon was never recovered. GPS last position showed it at altitude, but search efforts found nothing. The amateur group concluded equipment failure, but they couldn't explain why all systems failed at once, or why GPS showed impossible position jumps before failure, or why the balloon vanished so completely. Firmament researchers catalogue this as the balloon hitting the barrier. They claim the altitude, around 130,000 feet, is consistent with other incidents. They suggest this is where the firmament begins, where the enclosed system transitions to whatever lies beyond. But balloons fail. Electronics malfunction. GPS can give false readings. The simplest explanation is technical failure plus bad luck in recovery. Except the pattern exists across multiple incidents. Different groups, different equipment, similar altitudes, similar failures. Is that statistically significant? Or is it confirmation bias, selectively remembering failures that fit the theory while ignoring the hundreds of successful high-altitude balloon flights that encountered no anomalies? I didn't know. I couldn't know without comprehensive data on all high-altitude balloon flights, their failure rates, the specific altitudes where failures occur, the types of failures experienced. That data might exist somewhere, but I didn't have access to it, and without it, I was left with anecdotes, patterns that might be real or might be imagined. This is the frustration of investigating the firmament theory. The evidence is always almost compelling but never quite definitive, suggestive but not conclusive, enough to maintain curiosity but not enough to force conviction. The cracks in the sky, if they exist, are subtle, not gaping holes that prove the barrier but hints, glimpses, moments when the ordinary seems slightly wrong in ways that resist easy explanation. Firmament researchers call this the veil effect. The truth is not hidden perfectly. It shows through occasionally, but it shows through ambiguously, in ways that can always be explained away by those committed to the conventional model. If you believe in the firmament, these anomalies confirm it. If you believe in infinite space, these anomalies are explained away. The data doesn't force a conclusion. It allows interpretation. And interpretation, I was realizing, is everything. The same observations that convince one person leave another unmoved. Not because one is smart and the other stupid, but because they start from different assumptions about what's possible. The firmament theory doesn't need smoking gun evidence. It needs accumulated anomalies, unexplained phenomena, gaps in official explanation. It thrives on uncertainty, on the recognition that we know less than we pretend to know. And in a world built on claimed certainty, admitting uncertainty is radical. Chapter 10. The unanswered question. By the time I reached this point in my research, I realized the firmament theory is not something you prove or disprove in a conventional sense. It's a framework, a lens, a way of interpreting the same data everyone else has access to but arriving at different conclusions. The question is not whether the sky is solid. The question is, how would we know if it was? If we live inside a closed system, if the sky is a boundary we cannot cross, then every piece of evidence we encounter would be interpreted through a model that assumes the opposite. We would see launches, orbits, satellites, space stations, and we would assume they prove infinite space because that's the only framework we've been given. But what if the framework is wrong? What if everything we observe is real but explained incorrectly? I thought about how science progresses. The standard story is that new evidence forces new theories. We observe something that doesn't fit the current model, so we develop a better model. Truth emerges through accumulation of knowledge. But that's not quite accurate. Science changes through paradigm shifts. An old framework is replaced not when evidence disproves it, but when a new framework explains the same evidence more effectively. The classic example is the transition from Newtonian physics to relativity. Newton's laws worked perfectly for everyday phenomena. They still do. Engineers use Newtonian mechanics for most calculations, but Einstein showed that at extreme velocities and gravitational fields, Newton's laws were approximations, not absolute truths. Einstein didn't prove Newton wrong. He showed that Newton's framework was incomplete, useful within certain limits but inadequate for the full range of physical phenomena. Could the same be true for cosmology? Could the infinite space model be useful, predictive, effective for certain purposes, but fundamentally incomplete? Firmament theorists believe so. They argue that the heliocentric infinite universe model works because it's internally consistent, not because it's true. You can make accurate predictions, build working technology, navigate successfully, all while operating within a flawed framework. Because frameworks don't have to be true to be useful. Ptolemy's geocentric model was useful for over 1,000 years. It made accurate predictions. It allowed navigation, calendar keeping, astronomical observation. The fact that it was based on Earth being the centre didn't prevent it from functioning. Copernicus's heliocentric model was simpler, but it wasn't immediately more accurate. Early heliocentric calculations were often less precise than Ptolemaic ones. The model won not because it was proven true, but because, over time, it proved more adaptable, more elegant, more compatible with emerging physics. Now we have Einstein's relativity, which tells us that there is no absolute frame of reference. Motion is relative to the observer. You can describe the universe from a geocentric perspective or a heliocentric perspective, and both are mathematically valid. This is mind-bending. It means that, in a sense, the ancient geocentric model was not wrong. It was one valid description among many. Firmament theorists seize on this. If motion is relative, if there's no absolute frame of reference, then claiming Earth orbits the Sun is no more true than claiming the Sun orbits Earth. Both are valid perspectives. Both can be used to calculate planetary positions. The choice between them is not empirical, it's practical. We choose the heliocentric model because it makes the math simpler, not because it's objectively true, and if that choice is practical rather than true, then other choices are possible. Other frameworks, other cosmologies. The firmament model is one such alternative. It takes the same observations, planetary motion, the appearance of the sky, the behaviour of light and gravity, and interprets them through a framework of enclosed Earth rather than infinite space. Does it work as well as the standard model? For some purposes, yes. For others, no. It requires different mathematics, different assumptions, different explanations for various phenomena. But so did heliocentrism when it first challenged geocentrism. So did relativity when it challenged Newton. New frameworks are always awkward at first. They must be developed, refined, tested against accumulated observations. The firmament model has not undergone that rigorous development. It exists mostly at the margins, among independent researchers without institutional support. It has no funding, no laboratories, no peer review process. Is that because it's wrong? Or because it's unacceptable? I started to wonder, what would it take to actually test the firmament hypothesis rigorously? You would need independent access to high altitudes, the ability to launch your own rockets or balloons equipped with instruments designed to detect boundaries rather than assuming infinite space. You would need access to raw satellite data, unprocessed, with full metadata. the ability to verify that images from space are what they claim to be rather than composites or reconstructions. You would need permission to explore Antarctica independently, without restrictions, to circumnavigate it in ways that would definitively confirm or deny its shape. You would need the ability to repeat historical experiments like measuring Earth's curvature or testing for rotation with modern equipment transparently, with results that can't be dismissed as error or misinterpretation. All of this is theoretically possible, but practically, nearly impossible without institutional backing, and institutions are committed to the current model. They have no incentive to test alternatives that threaten foundational assumptions. This is the epistemological trap. The people with resources to test the firmament hypothesis rigorously are the same people who would lose credibility if it were proven true. The people motivated to test it lack the resources, so the hypothesis remains untested, not disproven but not verified, existing in a liminal space between rejected idea and genuine alternative. Firmament theorists argue this is intentional. The system protects itself not through active suppression, but through structural barriers. Make independent verification prohibitively expensive, restrict access to necessary locations, classify alternative frameworks as fringe before they can be seriously examined. Is this conspiracy, or is it simply how institutions function? They conserve what works, they resist change, they defend their paradigms not from malice but from investment, intellectual, professional, financial. Thomas Kuhn called this normal science. The day-to-day work of science happens within accepted paradigms. Revolutionary challenges to those paradigms are rare and resisted until the accumulated anomalies become overwhelming. Have the anomalies around cosmology become overwhelming? Firmament theorists believe so. They point to dark matter and dark energy, mysterious substances invented to make observations fit the model. They point to the cosmological constant problem, the horizon problem, the flatness problem, fundamental questions in cosmology that remain unanswered. They argue that maybe these aren't problems with the details, but problems with the foundation. Maybe the model itself is wrong, and no amount of adjustment will make it right. But mainstream cosmology responds. These are puzzles, not failures. Science always has unsolved problems. That doesn't mean the framework is wrong, just incomplete. Who's right? I couldn't say. Both arguments have merit. Science is always incomplete, but sometimes incompleteness indicates deeper error. What struck me most was the realization that I couldn't decide through pure reason. The question is too large, too foundational. It touches on epistemology, metaphysics, the nature of knowledge itself. How do we know what we know? Through observation, through authority, through institutional consensus, through personal verification. Each method has strengths and weaknesses. Each can lead us astray. And when they conflict, when observation seems to contradict authority, when personal investigation challenges consensus, we must choose which to trust. That choice reveals our values, what we believe about truth, knowledge, power, and trust. The firmament theory asks us to distrust authority, to question consensus, to privilege direct observation over expert interpretation. This is appealing to people who feel betrayed by institutions. It's threatening to people who depend on those institutions for meaning and structure. But it's not simply right or wrong. It's a different epistemological stance, with different risks and different rewards. Trust authority. You might be deceived, but you benefit from accumulated knowledge. Distrust authority. You might discover hidden truth, but you might fall into paranoid delusion. Both paths are dangerous. Both require wisdom to navigate. I don't have that wisdom. I'm still learning. Still trying to figure out how to evaluate claims that exceed my ability to verify directly. The firmament theory taught me this much. I know less than I thought I knew. The confidence I had in modern cosmology was not based on personal investigation, but on trust. And trust, while necessary, is not knowledge. Maybe the sky is solid. Maybe it's infinite void. Maybe the truth is something neither model captures. But the question matters. Not because answering it will change how I live. I'll still wake up, work, eat, sleep regardless of the sky's nature. but because asking it reveals the limits of my knowledge and the structure of my beliefs. And those limits, those structures, are worth examining whether the firmament exists or not. The exercise of questioning fundamental assumptions has value. It makes me more careful about certainty, more aware of how much I accept on faith, more humble about the difference between what I know and what I've been taught. And maybe that's the real purpose of the firmament theory. Not to prove the sky is solid, but to prove that we're still capable of asking. The resistance to that question, the immediate dismissal, the reflex that says this is too absurd to consider, that resistance might be the most interesting data of all. Because if the sky is solid, if we live in a contained world, then the system would not need to hide it perfectly. It would only need to make the idea of questioning it feel absurd, and it has succeeded. Epilogue. Living under a ceiling. I looked up at the night sky after finishing my research. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Calm, infinite, open. The stars were bright. The moon hung low on the horizon. The key of darkness stretched on forever, or seemed to. I didn't know if the firmament was real. I still don't. But I understood why the theory persists. Why it attracts people who are not fools, not uneducated, not detached from reality. It persists because it asks a question that should not matter but does. What if the most fundamental assumption of modern cosmology is wrong? If the sky was never meant to open? If we live inside something rather than on something? If the boundary above us is real but invisible? Then the greatest illusion would be believing it already disappeared. And perhaps that's the point. Not to prove the firmament exists, but to prove that we are still allowed to ask. I turned away from the sky and went inside. The stars remained where they were, fixed or distant, solid or infinite. I would never know for certain, but I would keep looking, because some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. And maybe that's exactly what they're afraid of. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And if you enjoy these deep dives into history's mysteries, please subscribe. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Dogface680, and we cannot thank you enough for this idea. This is one of the most compelling conspiracy theories rooted in actual Cold War history, and what makes it so haunting is how much of it is documented fact. What you're about to hear sounds impossible. A 4-star general, a war hero, the man who helped liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny, dead in a hospital bed just months after victory, following a minor car accident that shouldn't have killed anyone. No autopsy, no investigation. Medical records vanished, witnesses disappeared, and decades later, a former intelligence operative steps forward with a confession that changes everything. This is the story of General George Smith Patton Jr., the man who won the war but lost the peace, the general who believed he had fought in past lives alongside Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed in destiny and glory and refused to be silent when silence was demanded. This is the story of his mysterious death, and the conspiracy theory that suggests the greatest threat to George Patton wasn't the Nazi Wehrmacht, it was his own government. December 9th, 1945. Near Mannheim, Germany. The war is over. Europe lies in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble. Railways destroyed. Bridges collapsed. Millions dead. Millions more displaced. The Third Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, lasted 12 and ended in a Berlin bunker with a gunshot. Victory belongs to the Allies. And General George Smith Patton Jr., the most aggressive, most decorated, most controversial American commander of World War II, sits in occupied Germany with nothing left to conquer. He is 60 years old. His hair is silver. His face is weathered from years of command in the Mediterranean sun, the French countryside, the German winter. He wears his pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, relics of an earlier era when generals still led cavalry charges. He looks like something from another century, and in many ways he is. Patton believes he fought at the walls of Troy. He believes he rode with the Romans into Carthage. He believes he charged with Napoleon at Austerlitz. Past life memories, he calls them. Visions of ancient battles that feel more real than dreams. His officers think he's eccentric. His soldiers think he's touched by God. His enemies learned not to think about him at all until it was too late. But now, in December 1945, Patton is no longer commanding armies. He is no longer shaping strategy. He is no longer needed. The Third Army, which he led across France and into the heart of Germany, has been reassigned. His new command is a paper organisation with no soldiers, no tanks, no mission beyond compiling reports that no one will read. He is waiting to go home, and he is angry. That morning, December 9th, Patton wakes before dawn in his quarters at Bad Nauheim, a spa town north of Frankfurt that serves as headquarters for what remains of his command. He eats breakfast alone, as is his custom. Eggs, toast, coffee. He reviews intelligence reports from the Soviet occupation zone. He reads dispatches from Washington. He writes in his diary, the leather-bound journal he has kept since West Point, filling page after page with his cramped handwriting. Today's entry is bitter. They have sidelined me. Eisenhower fears what I might say. The politicians fear what I might do. The Soviets fear I might be right. So here I sit, a relic, while Europe burns. He signs his name with a flourish, as always. George Smith Patton Jr., 4 stars, Third Army. At 9:30 in the morning, he receives word that a pheasant hunting expedition has been arranged for that afternoon. It's one of his few remaining pleasures, a brief escape from the tedium of meaningless command. His Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, will accompany him. They'll take one of the staff cars, drive south toward Mannheim, spend a few hours in the countryside. It should be routine. At 11 o'clock, Patton descends the stairs of his headquarters building. His boots echo on the marble floors. Officers snap to attention as he passes. He returns their salutes mechanically, his mind already elsewhere, already planning the afternoon hunt, already thinking about the estate where the pheasants run wild. Outside, a Cadillac Model 75 sedan waits. Black paint, chrome trim, the kind of vehicle befitting a general officer. The driver stands beside it, a young private first class who has been assigned to Patton's detail for less than 2 weeks. This is the first irregularity. Patton's regular driver, a sergeant named John Mims, who had driven him for 3 years through combat and occupation, was transferred on December 1st. No explanation was given. Mims, interviewed decades later by researchers, said the transfer was sudden and unusual. He was given orders to report to another unit immediately. He never drove for Patton again. The replacement driver's name is in the accident report, but researchers have never been able to locate his service records. The man seems to have vanished from military documentation after December 9th. Patton climbs into the back seat. General Gay joins him. The driver starts the engine. They pull out of the headquarters compound and onto the road leading south. It's a cold morning. Frost covers the fields. The sky is grey, low clouds threatening snow. The roads are in poor condition, still cratered from the fighting, still littered with debris from the bombardment that reduced Mannheim to ruins earlier in the war. Traffic is light, a few military trucks, some civilian vehicles, German citizens walking along the roadside, bundled against the cold, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. Patton watches the landscape pass. He has driven these roads dozens of times. He knows every turn, every checkpoint, every landmark. At approximately 11:45, near a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim, the car approaches an intersection. A United States Army truck, a 2.5-ton vehicle painted olive drab, approaches from a side road. What happens next takes 3 seconds. The truck makes a sudden left turn, cutting directly across the path of Patton's Cadillac. The driver of the Cadillac swerves right, tyres skidding on the frost-slicked pavement. The vehicles collide, the sound of metal against metal, the crunch of breaking glass, the hiss of steam from a ruptured radiator, and then silence. The driver of the Cadillac climbs out, shaken but uninjured. General Gay opens his door, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. A few bruises, perhaps. Nothing serious. He turns to check on Patton and sees him slumped in the back seat, conscious but unable to move. "My neck," Patton says quietly. "I think my neck is broken." Within minutes, military police arrive. Within an hour, Patton is on his way to Heidelberg. Within days, the official story begins to fracture under the weight of its own inconsistencies. And within 12 days, George Smith Patton Jr. is dead. Chapter 1. The General Who Became a Problem. To understand why conspiracy theories surround Patton's death, you have to understand who Patton was in the final months of his life, and more importantly, what he represented to the emerging Cold War order. George Smith Patton Jr. was never meant for peacetime. He was born into a military family in California in 1885. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy. His father was a politician. Young George grew up hearing stories of cavalry charges and desperate last stands, of honour and glory and the warrior's code. He attended the Virginia Military Institute, then West Point. He competed in the Stockholm Olympics in 1912, finishing 5th in the modern pentathlon. He served under General John Pershing in Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa through the desert. He commanded tanks in World War I, was wounded in combat, came home with a chest full of medals and a reputation as a fighter. Between the wars, he studied. He read military history obsessively. Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal, Frederick the Great, Napoleon. He believed war was an art form, that great commanders were born, not made, that destiny selected certain men for greatness. He believed he was one of those men. When World War II came, Patton was ready. He commanded American forces in North Africa, in Sicily, in France. His Third Army swept across Europe faster than anyone thought possible. His tactics were aggressive, sometimes reckless. He believed in speed and shock and overwhelming force. He believed hesitation killed more soldiers than enemy fire. His methods worked. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. They repositioned entire divisions based on intelligence about Patton's location. They assumed wherever Patton was, the main attack would follow. Often, they were right. But Patton was more than just a brilliant tactician. He was also politically tone-deaf, personally abrasive, and constitutionally incapable of diplomacy. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, calling them cowards. He gave speeches praising the fighting spirit of the German army. He made jokes about the Holocaust that appalled other officers. He criticised Allied strategy in press conferences. He feuded with British commanders. He defied orders when he thought they were stupid. Eisenhower protected him during the war because Patton won battles. But when the war ended, Patton became expendable. More than that, he became dangerous. Because Patton refused to accept the post-war order. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Allied leaders meet in Potsdam to negotiate the peace. Europe is divided. The Soviet Union takes the East, America and Britain take the West. Borders are redrawn, governments are installed, Millions of people are displaced, moved, relocated to fit the new map. Patton watches this happen and sees betrayal. The Allies, he argues, fought to liberate Europe from tyranny. Now they're handing half of Europe to Stalin, a dictator as brutal as Hitler, a regime as totalitarian as the Nazis. He makes this argument publicly. In June 1945, Patton gives a speech in Los Angeles comparing the Soviet Communist Party to the Nazi Party. He calls both totalitarian threats to freedom. He suggests the Allies defeated the wrong enemy, that Germany should have been turned against the Soviet Union instead of being destroyed. The backlash is immediate. Politicians demand his resignation. Newspapers condemn him. The War Department issues official reprimands. President Truman, already dealing with the complexities of Soviet relations, is furious. Eisenhower summons Patton to his headquarters. The meeting does not go well. Eisenhower and Patton were friends once. They rose through the ranks together, served together between the wars, understood each other. But the war changed them both. Eisenhower became a political general, a coalition builder, a man who understood that winning the peace required compromise and patience. Patton remained a warrior who believed wars should be fought without hesitation and won without apology. In Eisenhower's office, Patton is told his public statements are unacceptable. He is ordered to stop criticising Soviet policy. He is warned that further incidents will result in his removal from command. Patton argues back. He presents intelligence reports about Soviet violations of ceasefire agreements. He describes forced population transfers, summary executions, political purges. He insists someone needs to tell the American people what's happening in occupied Europe. Eisenhower tells him that someone is not going to be Patton. The conversation ends badly. Within weeks, Patton is relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper organisation with no operational role. His job now is to compile lessons learned from the European campaign, to write reports analysing tactics and strategy for future military planners. It's a desk job. To a man like Patton, it's worse than death. Internal War Department memos from this period reveal the thinking behind the reassignment. One memo describes Patton as politically dangerous and increasingly uncontrollable. Another warns that Patton's celebrity status among soldiers and veterans makes him a potential political threat to current foreign policy initiatives. A third memo, written by a senior intelligence officer, suggests that Patton's return to the United States should be delayed indefinitely to prevent him from influencing public opinion regarding Soviet intentions. These memos were classified for decades. When they were finally released under Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s, they revealed something important. By October 1945, senior American officials viewed Patton not as an asset but as a liability, and they were actively working to neutralise him. Chapter 2. The Diaries and the Warnings. General Patton kept meticulous diaries throughout his military career. These weren't casual journals. They were detailed historical records, written in his own hand, documenting everything from tactical decisions to personal reflections. He wrote almost every day, sometimes for hours, filling leather-bound volumes with his cramped, precise handwriting. He believed history would vindicate him. He wanted his perspective preserved for future generations. After his death, the diaries were collected by his family. Some entries were published in biographies, others remained private for decades. Some have never been fully released, held back by the Patton family estate for reasons never publicly explained. But the entries that have been made public from October and November 1945 paint a disturbing picture of a man who believed he was being watched, controlled, and silenced. October 2nd, 1945. Patton attends a meeting with Soviet officers to coordinate occupation zones. The meeting is tense. The Soviets refuse to cooperate on prisoner exchanges. They deny Allied access to certain territories. They claim violations of ceasefire agreements that Patton knows are fabricated. He writes, "The Russians are impossible. They lie about everything. They're worse than the Nazis and no one wants to admit it. Eisenhower orders me to maintain diplomatic relations. I'd rather maintain my rifle aimed at their headquarters." October 15th, 1945. Patton inspects Soviet troop positions along the occupation zone boundary. He notes their equipment, their readiness, their disposition. What he sees alarms him. He writes, "Soviet forces are not demobilizing. They're repositioning. They have combat units forward deployed, supply lines established, logistics prepared for offensive operations. If we have to fight them, and I believe we will, we should do it now while our armies are still here, still equipped, still ready. In 2 years, we'll have nothing in Europe, and they'll have everything." October 23rd, 1945. Patton meets with German civilians, former Wehrmacht officers, refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. They tell him stories of mass arrests, forced labour, summary executions, entire villages emptied. He writes, "We promised these people freedom. We told them we were liberating them from tyranny. Now we're handing them to Stalin, who is every bit as brutal as Hitler. The only difference is Stalin is our ally, so we pretend not to see what he's doing. History will judge us harshly for this betrayal." October 31st, 1945. Patton submits a request for extended leave to return to the United States. He wants to visit family, rest, recover from years of combat command. He also wants to speak freely, away from military censorship about what he's witnessed in Europe. The request is denied by the War Department. No explanation is provided. He writes, "They want me here where they can watch me, where they can control what I say, where I can't reach the American people. I understand their game now." November 7th, 1945. Patton has lunch with a journalist from the New York Herald Tribune. The interview is supposed to be off the record, a background briefing about post-war Europe. Patton speaks candidly about Soviet intentions, about Allied failures, about the need for American military readiness. 2 days later, the journalist contacts Patton. The interview has been killed by editors. Someone from the War Department called the newspaper and asked that the story not run. The journalist is apologetic but clear. The article will not be published. Patton writes, "Even the press is controlled now. The truth is too dangerous for the American people to hear. They want everyone to believe we won the war and everything is fine now. But nothing is fine. Everything we fought for is being given away, and anyone who points this out is silenced." November the 19th, 1945. Patton receives notice that his security detail is being changed. His regular driver, his aides, his bodyguards, men who have served with him for years are being reassigned. New personnel are being assigned to replace them. The official reason is routine rotation of personnel. Patton doesn't believe it. He writes, "They're putting watchers around me, new people who report to someone else. I recognise the pattern. I've used it myself in our intelligence operations. When you want to monitor someone, you put your own people next to them. I'm being treated like a security threat in my own command." November 25th, 1945. Patton's wife, Beatrice, writes him from the United States. She's worried about him. His letters have become dark, paranoid. He writes about being watched, about feeling trapped. She asks if he's well. He writes back, but his response never makes it into his diary. Later, Beatrice told biographers that Patton's letter frightened her. He wrote that he was planning to return home soon, and caused them a lot of trouble. He wrote that he intended to speak publicly about Soviet aggression and Allied failures. He wrote that he knew this would end his military career, but he didn't care anymore. He wrote, "Some fights are worth the cost." December 1st, 1945. Patton's regular driver, Sergeant John Mims, is abruptly transferred to another unit. Mims has driven Patton for 3 years through North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. He knows Patton's habits, his routes, his preferences. He's loyal, competent, trusted. The transfer happens overnight. Mims is given orders to report immediately to a quartermaster unit in Belgium. He's not allowed to say goodbye to Patton. A new driver is assigned, a young private first class who's been in the European theatre for less than 3 months. Patton writes, "Even my driver is replaced now. They're not even being subtle about it anymore." This is Patton's last diary entry. 8 days later, he's in the car accident. Chapter 3. The collision that changed everything. December the 9th, 1945. Late morning. General Patton's Cadillac sedan leaves his headquarters in Bad Nauheim at approximately 1100 hours. The sky is overcast, threatening snow. Temperature is just above freezing. The roads are slick with frost but passable. Patton sits in the back seat. He's dressed in his uniform, wearing his leather jacket against the cold. His pearl-handled revolvers are on his hips. He carries a walking stick, an affectation from his days of cavalry service. Major General Hobart Gay sits beside him. Gay has served as Patton's chief of staff throughout the war. He's one of Patton's few remaining friends in the High Command, one of the few officers who still speaks to him regularly after his controversial statements. The new driver, whose name appears in the accident report as Private First Class Horace Woodring, sits behind the wheel. He's nervous. He's only driven for Patton a handful of times. He's not familiar with the General's preferences, his habits, his routes. The drive should take less than an hour. They follow the main road south from Bad Nauheim, through small German towns still recovering from the war. Mannheim was one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. The RAF and American 8th Air Force dropped thousands of tons of explosives on its industrial districts. Much of the city centre was destroyed. Rebuilding has barely begun. The roads through Mannheim are in poor condition. Craters from bombs, debris from collapsed buildings. Some streets are still blocked entirely, forcing detours through unfamiliar routes. At 11:43, according to the accident report, Patton's Cadillac approaches a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim. The area is semi-rural, factories mixed with farmland. Traffic is light. A United States Army truck, identified in the report as a GMC 2.5-ton cargo vehicle, approaches from a side road on the left. According to the truck driver's statement, taken by military police at the scene, he did not see the Cadillac approaching. He claimed the sun was in his eyes, though the day was overcast. He claimed he was unfamiliar with the intersection, though the road was clearly marked. He claimed he made the turn at normal speed, though witnesses said the truck accelerated suddenly. The Cadillac's driver swerves right to avoid impact. Too late. The vehicles collide at the intersection. Now here's where the official story begins to fall apart. The collision is low speed. The Cadillac is travelling approximately 35 miles per hour. The truck is travelling approximately 15 miles per hour. The impact is glancing, not head-on. The Cadillac's front passenger side strikes the truck's rear cargo area. The damage is minor. The Cadillac's front bumper is bent. The headlight is broken. The hood is dented. The truck's rear panel is scraped but intact. Both vehicles remain operational. The Cadillac's driver, Private First Class Woodring, is uninjured. He has a small bruise on his hand from the steering wheel. Nothing else. Major General Gay is uninjured. He experiences momentary shock from the impact, but suffers no physical trauma. The truck driver is uninjured. He climbs out of his cab without assistance. General Patton, sitting in the back seat of the Cadillac, suffers catastrophic injuries. According to the initial medical assessment, Patton was thrown forward in the collision. His head struck a metal partition or support structure in the car's interior. The impact caused acute cervical spine trauma, specifically a comminuted fracture of the third cervical vertebra and a vertical fracture of the fourth cervical vertebra. The injury results in immediate complete paralysis from the neck down. Multiple forensic analysts who examined the case decades later noted severe inconsistencies with this explanation. First, the injury pattern. A forward impact of the type described should cause predictable trauma. Facial injuries, chest contusions, possibly head trauma. The passenger would hit the seat in front of them, the back of the driver's seat, which is padded. Instead, Patton sustained a precise cervical fracture with no facial injuries, no chest trauma, no head contusions. Second, the biomechanics. For Patton to strike the partition with enough force to fracture his cervical spine, he would need to be travelling at significant speed relative to the car's interior. But the collision was low speed, and Patton was seated wearing his heavy leather jacket, which would have provided some padding. Third, the other passengers, both the driver and General Gay, sitting in front of Patton, experienced minimal impact forces. Gay later described the collision as A solid bump, nothing more. Yet Patton, behind them, experienced forces sufficient to break his neck. One forensic pathologist who reviewed the case in the 1990s suggested the injury pattern was more consistent with a direct blow to the back or side of the neck, the kind of trauma that might result from being struck by a hard object, rather than from impact with a car's interior. Another analyst noted that the specific fracture pattern, comminuted fracture of cervical 3, vertical fracture of cervical 4, is relatively rare in motor vehicle accidents, but more common in cases of direct trauma to the posterior neck. Without an autopsy, without X-rays beyond the initial hospital films, without detailed forensic analysis, these observations remain speculative. But they raise questions. Then there's the matter of the truck driver. According to the accident report, the driver was interviewed by military police at the scene. He provided a statement describing the collision. He was cited for failure to yield. He was released. His name appears in the report as Private Robert Thompson. No unit is listed. No serial number is recorded. No permanent address is given. Researchers have spent decades trying to locate Private Robert Thompson. Military personnel databases have no record of anyone by that name serving in the European theatre in December 1945. The truck's serial number, listed in the accident report, corresponds to a vehicle assigned to the Quartermaster Corps. But when historians tried to trace the vehicle's movement logs, maintenance records, and assignment history, they found nothing. The truck existed on paper, but vanished from all documentation after December 9th. The military police who responded to the scene should have filed detailed reports, taken photographs, secured evidence. Standard accident investigation procedure, especially for a collision involving a 4-star general. No photographs were ever released. The military police reports were classified, then reported lost. No physical evidence from the scene was preserved. Within hours, the Cadillac was repaired and returned to the motor pool. The truck disappeared entirely. And Private Robert Thompson was never seen again. Chapter 4. 12 days in Heidelberg. The Heidelberg Army Hospital in December 1945 was one of the finest medical facilities in Europe. It had treated thousands of wounded soldiers during the war. It had experienced trauma surgeons, skilled nurses, modern equipment for 1940s medicine. The hospital specialised in combat injuries, including complex trauma cases that required intensive care. Spinal injuries like Patton's were rare but not unprecedented. The medical staff understood the protocols: immobilisation, prevention of secondary injury, monitoring for complications, physical therapy when possible. Patton arrived at the hospital at approximately 1300 hours on December 9th, less than 90 minutes after the accident. He was conscious, alert, able to speak. He described the accident to doctors. He reported complete loss of sensation and movement below his neck. He remained calm, even joking with the medical staff. "I've been closer to death than this before," he told one nurse. "I'll be fine." Initial X-rays confirmed the cervical fractures. Neurological examination confirmed complete paralysis below the level of injury. But the attending physicians were cautiously optimistic. The fractures, while severe, showed no signs of spinal cord transection. There was hope that with proper immobilisation and time, some nerve function might return. Complete recovery was unlikely, but partial recovery was possible. Patton was placed in skull traction, a device that immobilised his head and neck to prevent further injury. He was given oxygen support. His vital signs were monitored continuously. Nurses attended him around the clock. On December 10th, one day after the accident, Patton's condition appeared stable. His vital signs were strong. He was communicating with staff. He showed no signs of infection or complications. On December 11th, Patton's wife Beatrice arrived from the United States. The Army had arranged emergency transport, flying her across the Atlantic on a military aircraft. She was escorted by senior officers who had worked to expedite her travel. When she entered Patton's room, he smiled. "I'm in a hell of a fix this time," he told her. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. He couldn't feel it, but the gesture mattered. For the next few days, Patton's condition remained stable. Doctors noted slight improvement in some reflexes. There was cautious talk of eventual transfer to a specialised facility in the United States. Physical therapy was discussed. Patton himself remained optimistic. He made plans. He talked about recovery. He joked about getting back to work. On December 13th, 4 days after the accident, Patton's condition began to change. He developed a slight fever. His breathing became more laboured. Doctors suspected early pneumonia, a common complication in paralysed patients who cannot cough effectively to clear their lungs. Antibiotics were administered. Oxygen support was increased. On December 14th, the fever worsened. Patton's oxygen saturation dropped. His breathing became increasingly difficult. The medical staff worked to keep his airways clear, but the paralysis made it nearly impossible for him to assist in his own treatment. On December 15th, 6 days after the accident, Patton's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. He developed severe pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs. His heart rate became irregular. His blood pressure fluctuated wildly. The doctors diagnosed acute heart failure, possibly triggered by a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had travelled from his immobilised legs to his lungs. Emergency treatment was initiated, but Patton's condition continued to deteriorate. Over the next 6 days, he slipped in and out of consciousness. The fever persisted. The pulmonary edema worsened. His heart struggled to maintain adequate circulation. On December the 21st, 12 days after the accident, at 1750 hours, General George Smith Patton Jr. died. The official cause of death: pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure secondary to his injuries. The death certificate was signed by the attending physicians. The hospital issued a statement expressing condolences. The army notified next of kin. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and then the irregularities began. First, no autopsy was performed. This is unusual for several reasons. Patton was a 4-star general, one of the most prominent military figures in American history. His death under medical care, with unexpected complications arising rapidly, would normally warrant a thorough post-mortem examination. The official explanation was that the family declined an autopsy. But Beatrice Patton later disputed this claim. In interviews with biographers, she stated she was never asked about an autopsy. She said the army simply informed her that her husband's body would be prepared for burial and that no autopsy was necessary or planned. She said she didn't question the decision at the time. She was grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed. She trusted the military doctors who told her Patton died of natural complications from his injuries. Only later did she wonder why they were so insistent that no autopsy be performed. Second, Patton's complete medical records from Heidelberg Hospital were never released to the family. Beatrice requested the files multiple times over the following years. She wanted to understand what happened to her husband, why he declined so rapidly, whether everything possible had been done to save him. Her requests were denied. The army told her the medical records were classified for reasons of operational security. She was told the files contained sensitive information about medical procedures and treatment protocols that could not be disclosed. She never received the records. When historians and researchers sought the files decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests, they were told the records were missing. Some reports claim the files were destroyed in the 1960s per routine document retention policies. Other reports claim the files were lost when Heidelberg Hospital closed. Still other reports claim the files are held in classified archives but remain restricted. No one has seen Patton's complete medical records since December 1945. Third, several members of the medical staff who treated Patton were transferred shortly after his death. One surgeon was reassigned to a hospital in Japan. A nurse was transferred to a facility in England. The hospital administrator retired from military service within weeks of Patton's death. When researchers tried to interview these individuals in later years, most declined to participate. Some claimed they couldn't remember details of Patton's case. Others said they were bound by military confidentiality, even decades later. One physician agreed to an interview but died before it could be conducted. One nurse who worked in Heidelberg Hospital during December 1945 gave a brief interview to a researcher in 1976. She described unusual activity in the days before Patton died. She mentioned restricted access to Patton's room. She said only certain staff members were allowed to enter. She described visitors who came late at night, men in military uniforms who weren't logged in the visitor registry. She mentioned medical procedures that weren't part of standard treatment protocols. She said Patton received injections she didn't recognise, medications that weren't listed on his chart. When the researcher pressed for details, the nurse became vague and uncomfortable. She ended the interview abruptly and refused further contact. She died 2 years later. No additional interviews were ever conducted. Fourth, the timeline of Patton's decline doesn't match typical post-injury progression. Spinal injury patients certainly face complications. Pneumonia is common because paralysed patients cannot clear their lungs effectively. Blood clots are common because immobilised patients cannot move their limbs. Heart failure can occur due to the stress of injury and prolonged bed rest. But the speed and severity of Patton's decline struck some medical experts as unusual. One pulmonologist who reviewed the case in the 1980s noted that Patton went from stable and communicative to critical and dying in less than a week. While complications can arise quickly, the progression described in the available documentation seemed unusually rapid for a patient receiving intensive care in a modern facility. Another physician, a toxicologist, reviewed the symptoms described in newspaper reports from December 1945. Sudden pulmonary edema, cardiac arrhythmia, rapid deterioration. He noted these symptoms could result from injury complications, but they could also result from certain poisonous substances. Specifically, he mentioned digitalis toxicity, which causes cardiac complications and pulmonary edema, and would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening. Without an autopsy, without tissue samples, without toxicology analysis, there's no way to confirm or deny such theories. But the possibility exists, and that possibility, combined with all the other irregularities, fuels the conspiracy theory that Patton didn't die from his injuries. He was killed. Chapter 5. The OSS operative's confession. For more than 30 years, the official narrative of Patton's death remained unchallenged. Tragic accident, medical complications, natural death given his injuries. Historians wrote biographies portraying Patton as a brilliant but troubled commander whose life ended in unfortunate circumstances. Filmmakers made movies celebrating his military genius while depicting his death as a sad footnote to a legendary career. His death was accepted as tragic but unremarkable. And then, in 1979, everything changed. An 84-year-old man named Douglas DeWitt Bazata walked into the office of a military historian working on a book about the Office of Strategic Services. Bazata said he had information about General Patton's death, information that had been classified for more than 3 decades, information that, if true, would rewrite history. Douglas Bazata was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a fringe figure seeking attention. He was a legitimate war hero with verifiable credentials and a documented history of service in America's wartime intelligence apparatus. Born in 1911, Bazata grew up in Pennsylvania and joined the Marine Corps in the early 1930s. He served in various capacities until the outbreak of World War II, when he was recruited by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency. The OSS conducted some of the most sensitive operations of the war: espionage, sabotage, assassination, support for resistance movements, operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly and whose details remain classified even today. Bazata operated behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. He conducted sabotage operations against Nazi infrastructure. He organised partisan resistance networks. He gathered intelligence that helped Allied forces plan operations. His service record is documented in declassified OSS files. His decorations include the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and various foreign awards from governments he aided during the war. He was not a man prone to fantasy or fabrication, and he said he had killed George Patton, not personally, not directly, but as part of an operation ordered by senior American intelligence officials. According to Bazata, in late November 1945, he was approached by a high-ranking OSS officer. Bazata declined to name this officer publicly, saying only that he held a senior position in intelligence operations and had authority to order field operations without political oversight. The officer told Bazata that General Patton had become a problem. Patton's public criticisms of Soviet policy were undermining Allied unity at a crucial moment. The Cold War was beginning. The Yalta Conference had established a delicate balance between the United States and Soviet Union. American intelligence agencies were working to establish networks in Eastern Europe, networks that required Soviet cooperation, or at least Soviet tolerance. Patton's rhetoric threatened all of it. His threats to return to the United States and speak publicly about Soviet aggression could turn American public opinion against cooperation with Stalin. His celebrity status among soldiers and veterans gave him a platform that could shape national policy. The officer told Bazata that political leadership had decided Patton needed to be silenced, permanently. Bazata claimed he refused at first. He argued that Patton was right about the Soviets, that someone needed to speak the truth about Soviet intentions. The officer told him this wasn't about truth. It was about stability. It was about maintaining diplomatic relationships long enough to establish American interests in post-war Europe. It was about preventing a premature confrontation with the Soviet Union that America wasn't ready to fight. The officer told him it was a matter of national security, and national security justified any action. Bazata claimed he was not directly involved in arranging the car accident. He said that aspect of the operation was handled by others, specialists in staged accidents and traffic collisions, but he confirmed the accident was not accidental. The truck driver, he said, was an operative, possibly OSS, possibly another agency. The collision was planned and executed as a way to remove Patton without raising suspicions of foul play. But the accident wasn't supposed to kill Patton. It was supposed to injure him seriously enough to prevent him from returning to the United States and speaking publicly. A career-ending injury that would sideline him while appearing accidental. The neck fracture was a bonus, ensuring Patton would never command again. But then Patton started to recover. Within days of the accident, doctors were talking about possible rehabilitation, about eventual transfer to the United States, about Patton potentially regaining some function. That wasn't acceptable. According to Bazata, the decision was made to finish the operation in the hospital. He claimed he was part of a team that had access to Heidelberg Hospital. They posed as medical staff or military visitors. They gained access to Patton's room, and they administered a substance that would trigger the complications that killed him. Bazata wouldn't specify what substance was used. He suggested something that would cause cardiac and pulmonary complications consistent with his injuries, something that would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening, something that would appear as natural progression of his condition. He said Patton died believing he was succumbing to his injuries, never knowing he was being murdered. Bazata claimed the operation was compartmentalized. Only a handful of people knew the full scope. The operatives involved were told only what they needed to know. Records were destroyed or classified. Witnesses were silenced through transfers, retirement, or more permanent means. He said Soviet intelligence was aware of the operation. They tacitly approved because Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric was creating problems for Stalin as well. But the Soviets were not directly involved. This was an American operation for American reasons. He said the decision came from senior levels of American intelligence, possibly with approval from political leadership, though he had no direct evidence of White House involvement. He said he had stayed silent for more than 30 years out of loyalty to his country and fear of retaliation against himself and his family. But now, in his 80s, with most of the principals dead, he wanted the truth known. He wanted history to record what actually happened. Bazata's confession was explosive. The researcher who first interviewed him was skeptical, but as Bazata provided details, as he named other operations he had participated in, as he described OSS procedures and protocols that matched declassified documents, the researcher began to believe Bazata was telling the truth, at least telling what he believed to be the truth. The researcher published a book in 1981 that included Bazata's claims. The book created immediate controversy. Historians dismissed Bazata as a fabricator, the CIA, successor to the OSS, denied any knowledge of operations targeting Patton. The army reaffirmed that Patton died of natural complications from his accident, but Bazata didn't recant. In 1984, he attended an OSS Veterans Reunion dinner in Washington, D.C. During the event, he stood and publicly repeated his claims about Patton's death. He told a room full of former intelligence operatives that he had been part of the operation. The room fell silent. No one challenged him. No one confirmed him. But no one laughed either. The silence was telling. Several attendees later told journalists they believed Bazata might be telling the truth. Others said the story was plausible, given what they knew about OSS operations during the period. Still others said Bazata was either lying or confused, mixing real operations with imagined ones. Douglas Bazata died in 1999 at age 88, maintaining his story until the end. To this day, no evidence has emerged to definitively prove or disprove his claims. But the fact that a legitimate OSS operative with a documented service record made such specific allegations has kept the conspiracy theory alive. Chapter 6. The Missing Evidence and the Cold War Context. If there was a conspiracy to assassinate General Patton, the evidence should exist somewhere. Intelligence agencies, even when conducting illegal operations, maintain records, operational plans, mission reports, personnel assignments, financial records, after-action reviews. These documents might be classified, compartmentalized, hidden in archives so secure that most government officials don't know they exist. But they exist. So researchers have been searching for decades. What they've found is a pattern of systematic absence. Every document that might confirm or disprove the assassination theory is either missing, destroyed, or classified beyond reach. Patton's medical records, missing. The accident investigation report, classified, then lost. OSS operational files from December 1945, heavily redacted. Personnel records for the truck driver, non-existent. Communications between the War Department and Patton's command, incomplete. Hospital visitor logs from Heidelberg, destroyed. Even routine documents that should exist, that have no national security implications, that would normally be preserved in military archives, are gone. This creates an evidentiary void. Conspiracy theorists point to the missing documents as proof of a cover-up. If there was nothing to hide, they argue, why are so many records missing? Skeptics argue that missing records prove nothing. Documents from 1945 are often incomplete. Archives have limited space. Files are destroyed per retention schedules. Sometimes things just get lost. Both arguments have merit, but the context matters. The Cold War was beginning in December 1945. The Office of Strategic Services was transitioning to the Central Intelligence Agency. American intelligence operations were becoming more sophisticated, more compartmentalized, more willing to conduct operations that violated both law and ethics in service of national security. We know this now because documents from that era have been declassified, slowly, over decades. We know about Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazi scientists to America despite their war crimes. We know about MK-Ultra, which conducted mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens. We know about COINTELPRO, which surveilled and disrupted domestic political groups. We know about assassination programs targeting foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. We know American intelligence agencies were capable of murder, deception, and massive cover-ups. So when someone suggests they might have killed an inconvenient general in 1945, it's not a crazy theory. It's consistent with what we know those agencies did. The question isn't whether American intelligence agencies were capable of such an operation. The question is whether they actually conducted one. And without the evidence, we cannot know for certain. Epilogue. What if Patton had lived? The final question haunts every discussion of Patton's death. What if he had survived? What if the accident had been less severe? What if he had recovered? What if he had returned to the United States? Would George Patton have become a political figure? Would he have run for office, bringing his celebrity status and military reputation into the political arena? Would he have testified before Congress about Soviet violations of the Yalta agreements, about forced population transfers, about political purges in Eastern Europe? Would he have written a book exposing what he viewed as Allied betrayals of the peoples we claim to liberate? Would he have shaped public opinion about the emerging Cold War? We'll never know. But the fact that we ask these questions reveals something important. Patton mattered. His voice mattered. His perspective, right or wrong, represented a viewpoint that vanished from American discourse after December 1945. Some historians argue that Patton's death was fortunate for America. His aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union could have triggered a premature confrontation that would have been catastrophic. The Cold War required careful management, patient containment, strategic diplomacy. Patton would have undermined all of that. Other historians argue that Patton was right, that confronting Soviet expansion immediately, while American forces were still mobilized in Europe, would have prevented decades of Cold War conflict, that his warnings about Stalin were prescient and should have been heeded. Both arguments assume Patton would have had significant influence if he had lived, and maybe that's why he died. The last line Patton wrote in his diary, just days before the accident, reads, "History will prove me right. They just don't want to hear it yet." He never got the chance to make his case. 79 years later, the debate continues. Was his death a tragic accident? A politically convenient outcome that some officials were relieved to see? Or a calculated assassination ordered by intelligence agencies that viewed him as a threat to national security? The files remain classified. The witnesses remain silent. The medical records remain missing. And George Smith Patton Jr. remains buried in Luxembourg, alongside the soldiers he commanded, his warnings unheeded, his voice silenced, his truth lost to history. Unless Douglas Bazata was telling the truth. Unless somewhere, in some classified archive, the evidence exists. Unless someday, someone finds the files that prove what really happened on that December morning in 1945. Until then, we're left with questions. And sometimes, the questions we cannot answer reveal more than the questions we can. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and want to support the channel in a way that helps more than you could possibly know, please consider using your hype points on this video. It makes a massive difference in helping us reach more people who love these kinds of mysteries, and if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. No pressure, but we really do enjoy connecting with all of you out there in the dark, wherever you are. Now, let's begin. The call came through at 3:47 in the morning, not to my phone, to my computer, through a chat program I hadn't opened in 6 years. The message was simple: you found it. Now you need to forget it. No profile picture, no username, just a string of random characters that looked like corrupted data. I stared at the screen in my dark apartment, the only light coming from my monitor and the distant glow of streetlights through half-closed blinds. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. I'd been awake for 31 hours straight, deep in a rabbit hole I'd promised myself I'd never go down again, the John Titor case. And now someone knew I'd found something that proved the most famous time traveller in internet history might have actually been real. Prologue. The night that started everything, December 14, 2000. Late night, coast to coast AM. I was 19 years old, living in a studio apartment in Tucson, working night shifts at a 24-hour copy centre. Insomnia had been my companion since childhood, and Art Bell's radio show had become my nightly ritual. The strange, the unexplained, the absolutely bizarre. Art covered it all with that signature gravelly voice that made even the most outlandish claims sound plausible. That night started like any other. I had the radio playing low while I reorganised my comic book collection, a mountain of back issues threatening to avalanche off my desk. Art was taking calls, the usual mix of UFO sightings and government conspiracy theories, when he mentioned something that made me stop mid-action. "We've been getting some interesting emails," Art said, that curious tone entering his voice, the one he used when something genuinely intrigued him. "From someone claiming to be posting on internet forums, says he's a time traveller from the year 2036. I set down the comic I was holding, an old X-Files tie-in issue, and turned up the volume. Art continued. "He's been posting since November, apparently. Calls himself John Titor. Says he's here on a military mission." There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. Let me read you what he wrote. Quote, "I am here on a military mission. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit." End quote. The words hung in the air of my tiny apartment. I'd heard hundreds of times, traveller claims on coast to coast over the years. They usually fell apart within minutes. Vague predictions, convenient excuses, obvious attention seekers. But something about this one felt different. The terminology, the specificity, the claim of a military mission rather than some grand save-the-world scenario. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down everything Art said. That night I became a John Titor follower. Just a fan, like thousands of others. I had no idea that 23 years later I'd uncover something that would make me wish I'd never heard that broadcast. Act 1. The original investigation, Chapter 1. Coast to Coast, an archive. Dive. Fast forward to November 2023. I'm 42 years old now. Still an insomniac. Still listening to Coast, though George Nuri hosts it now. Art Bell retired years ago and passed away in 2018, taking with him one of the most unique voices in radio history. I work as a data analyst for an insurance company, a job that pays well enough but leaves my mind understimulated. I spend my nights the way I spent them in 2000, diving into mysteries, reading forums, chasing threads that lead nowhere. But I hadn't touched the John Titor case in over a decade. It had been solved, more or less. Debunked, depending on who you asked. The general consensus was that Titor was an elaborate hoax, possibly connected to a Florida lawyer named Larry Haber, though nothing was ever proven. The predictions didn't come true. No American Civil War in 2005, no worldwide Olympics after 2004, no radical restructuring of society by 2015. Case closed. Move on. Except, I couldn't stop thinking about something I'd noticed years ago. Something that nagged at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. The audio. I'd saved copies of the Coast to Coast broadcast where Art Bell discussed Titor. 3 main episodes. January 12, 2001, the most famous appearance. January 15, 2001, the follow-up. And an open line night where multiple callers claimed Titor had contacted them privately. On a Wednesday night in early November, unable to sleep despite trying for 4 hours, I decided to listen to them again. Not for nostalgia, for something I remembered hearing but never investigated. I put on my headphones, opened the audio files, and started with the January 12 broadcast. Art's voice filled my ears, warm and welcoming, introducing the topic of time travel, then playing clips of someone claiming to be John Titor responding to questions, reading his posts aloud. I listened to the entire episode normally the first time through. Then I listened again with audio editing software open, frequency analysis running, sound isolated into different channels. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time. behind Art's voice, underneath the normal phone line static and compression artifacts of early 2000s radio broadcasting, there was a hum, a steady rhythmic hum that pulsed at irregular intervals. I isolated it, amplified it, ran it through spectral analysis. The hum wasn't random. It had structure, peaks and valleys at specific frequencies, and underneath that something else, a clicking pattern that repeated every 7 seconds. It sounded eerily similar to old modem handshake protocols, but deeper, more complex. I logged it in a document, anomalous audio signature in tighter broadcasts, possible line interference or encoding artifact, further investigation needed. At the time, I assumed it was just technical interference. Phone lines in 2000 weren't exactly high fidelity. Radio broadcasts went through multiple stages of compression and transmission. It could have been anything, but I kept listening. Chapter 2. John Titor's Real Claims. Over the next week, I went deeper than I'd ever gone before. I compiled every single post John Titor made to the forums where he originally appeared. Time Travel Institute and the old Art Bell post-to-post forums, both archived now but still accessible if you knew where to look. Titor's first post appeared on November 2nd, 2000, under the name timetravel_0. He described himself as an American soldier from the year 2036, sent back in time on a military mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975. The computer, he claimed, was needed to debug legacy Unix systems that would become critical in his timeline's future. His story was detailed, disturbingly detailed. He described his time machine, a C204 temporal displacement unit manufactured by General Electric. He posted technical diagrams showing a gravity distortion system using dual microsingularities held in magnetic suspension. He explained how the device worked, using terms like Kerr black holes and quantum field manipulation. He talked about his timeline's history, how a civil conflict would begin in America in 2005 following civil unrest and federal overreach, how it would escalate into a full civil war by 2008, how Russia would launch a nuclear strike in 2015, killing millions but ultimately leading to a simplified community-based society by 2036. He described life in his time, no internet as we knew it, decentralized communities, manual labour and agriculture being primary occupations, technology that was advanced in some ways but deliberately limited in others to prevent centralised control. He answered hundreds of questions, some scientific, some personal, some trying to trip him up. And when predictions didn't match our reality, when 2005 came and went without civil war, when the Olympics continued past 2004, when the nuclear strike didn't happen in 2015, Titor's defenders had a ready answer, because Titor himself had provided it. Many timelines exist, he'd written. Mine may not be yours. My presence here may have already altered events, or you may simply exist on a different world line than the one I departed from. It was the perfect escape clause, unfalsifiable, impossible to disprove because any discrepancy could be explained by timeline divergence. Genius if you were running a hoax, terrifying if you weren't. I read through everything again with fresh eyes, and I noticed patterns I'd missed before. Titor never made predictions that could be immediately verified. He spoke about things years in the future, always leaving enough gap time that verification was impossible in the moment. He answered technical questions with impressive detail, but always with enough vagueness that experts couldn't definitively say he was wrong. And he never, ever provided proof that couldn't be explained away, except for one thing, the physics. Several theoretical physicists had analysed Titor's explanations of time travel mechanics. While much of it was speculative, some of his descriptions of rotating black hole physics and closed time-like curves were remarkably sophisticated for a random internet poster in 2000. Not impossible for someone well read in theoretical physics to fake, but impressive nonetheless. One researcher noted that Titor's description of temporal acceleration matched some classified DARPA research that wasn't publicly known until 2004. How did a hoaxer know that in 2000? I added it to my notes, filed it under Interesting but Inconclusive. Chapter 3. The Haber Connection. Every investigation into John Titor eventually led to the same place. Larry Haber, an entertainment lawyer in Florida. The connection was discovered around 2009 by a group of dedicated researchers who traced internet records, domain registrations, and communication patterns. They found that the Titor family's communications, after John stopped posting in March 2001, were allegedly handled by Haber's legal office. Haber and his brother, Maury, were somehow connected to the Titor Foundation, an organisation that claimed to represent the Titor family. The foundation sold a book compiling Titor's posts, and even shopped around a movie deal at one point. The Haber brothers never confirmed or denied involvement in creating the Titor story. They maintained that they simply represented the interests of the time traveller's family, specifically his mother, who supposedly wanted to protect her son's identity. It was all very convenient and very suspicious. Over the years, researchers had tried to definitively prove the Haber connection. Some claimed success, others hit dead ends. The general consensus in the skeptical community was that one or both Haber brothers, possibly with accomplices, had created the entire Titor persona as either an elaborate art project or a potential media property. Case closed, right? I decided to reach out anyway. I found Larry Haber's law office contact information, still operating, still listed in Florida, and sent a carefully worded email. I identified myself as a researcher looking into the cultural impact of the John Titor story, asked if he'd be willing to discuss his involvement in representing the Titor family, and assured him I was approaching this from an academic perspective rather than as a debunker. 3 weeks passed, no response. I followed up. Still nothing. On the 4th week, I got a reply, but not from Haber. The email came from an address I didn't recognise. The subject line read, "Regarding your Titor inquiry." The message itself was brief. Some cases are closed for a reason. Let this one stay buried. No signature, no explanation. I tried to reply. The email bounced back. Address didn't exist. I should have stopped there. Act 2. The clue no one ever followed. Chapter 4. The lost interview tape. I've always had a weakness for old electronics. Ham radios, vintage computers, obsolete media formats. There's something appealing about technology from eras when things were built to last, when you could take apart a device and actually understand how it worked. That's why I found myself at a ham radio swap meet in Phoenix on a Saturday morning in late November. It was held in a community centre parking lot. Card tables loaded with vintage equipment, cables, antique radios, and boxes of components salvaged from who knows where. I was browsing a table of old broadcast equipment when a man next to me said, "You look like someone who appreciates the old stuff." I glanced over. He was probably in his late 60s, weathered face, wearing a trucker cap with a faded CB Radio Club logo. His table was mostly vintage CB equipment and cassette tapes of radio broadcasts. "Guilty," I said. "There's something about equipment from before everything became computerized." "Everything had character back then," he agreed. "Even the static sounded better." He chuckled at his own joke. "Name's Bill Anders. Ethan Ward." We shook hands. His grip was firm, the handshake of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands. "You collect broadcast tapes?" he asked, gesturing to his collection. "Sometimes. Depends what's on them." Bill studied me for a moment, then said something that made my stomach tighten. "You ever listen to Coast AM?" "All the time," I said carefully. "Been listening since the 90s. Art Bell fan? He was the best." Bill nodded slowly. Then he leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. "Then you might be interested in something I've got. Something that never aired." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" "Art Bell recorded an unaired call," Bill said, "from John Titor. You know who that is?" My heart started racing. I kept my expression neutral. "The time traveller guy, sure. The studio. Then cut out before it could air," Bill continued. "Happened sometimes with Art's setup, especially with weird calls that came through on specific frequencies. Producers usually destroyed recordings of dropped calls, But this one... He trailed off, looking around the swap meet casually. This one somebody leaked. I got a copy on cassette. From who? I asked. Someone who worked at the station, friend of a friend. Died about 5 years back. I've been holding on to it. Never knew what to do with it. Figured most people wouldn't care. But you... He looked at me with sharp eyes. You look like someone who'd care. Why are you telling me this? Bill shrugged. Getting old. Want to pass things on to people who'll appreciate them. And honestly, the tapes always creep me out a little. Rather have it in someone else's hands. He reached under his table and pulled out a plastic case with a cassette inside. The label was handwritten in faded ink. C2CAM, tighter call, never broadcast. How much? I asked. $20. I handed him the money so fast I nearly fumbled my wallet. Chapter 5. Audio Analysis. I didn't even wait until I got home. I stopped at a Goodwill on the way back and bought a cassette player for $8, drove to a parking lot and sat in my car with my laptop and a cassette to USB adapter I kept in my emergency kit for exactly these kinds of moments. The tape hissed to life. Art Bell's voice came through first, that familiar cadence. We have a caller on line 4 who says he has information about the temporal displacement claims. Go ahead, caller. Static. Then a voice. Distorted, like it was being filtered through something. Not dramatically altered, but wrong somehow. Like listening to someone talk through a bad connection. But the wrongness wasn't in the quality, it was in the sound itself. Art, this is John Titer, the voice said. I need to clarify something about the device specifications. Go ahead, John, we're listening. The voice continued, explaining something technical about the C204 unit's power requirements. But I barely heard the words. I was focused on the background. That hum. The same one I'd heard in the aired broadcasts, but clearer, much clearer. And there was more. An electronic sound layered beneath it. Not random static. Something structured. The call lasted maybe 90 seconds before the line went dead. Art's voice returned. Lost the caller. Let's go to line 6. I sat in my car and listened to the tape 4 more times. Then I drove home, transferred it to digital, and opened it in professional audio editing software. I spent the next 12 hours analysing that 90-second clip. First, I isolated the background sounds from the voice. Then I ran spectral analysis on the hum. Then I focused on the electronic noises underneath. What I found made me physically uncomfortable. The hum wasn't phone line interference. It was too clean, too structured. It pulsed at exact 7-second intervals with frequency variations that followed a mathematical pattern. When I graphed it, the pattern looked like a sine wave passing through a quantum probability field. Something I'd seen in papers about experimental physics, but never in audio recordings. The electronic sounds were even stranger. They resembled encrypted packet bursts, but deeper and more complex than anything used in commercial communications in 2000. When I ran them through frequency analysis, they contained patterns that matched military-grade encryption from the 1980s, specifically the kind used in classified communication systems that were only partially declassified in the late 90s. These sounds shouldn't exist on a phone line in 2000. They definitely shouldn't exist on a call to a radio show. I needed a professional opinion, but I couldn't risk asking anyone in my professional network. Too many questions, too much potential exposure. I found a freelance audio analyst on a forensics forum. Someone who advertised their services for legal cases and took anonymous clients. I created a burner email address, sent him the file with no context, and asked for a technical analysis of the background anomalies. I paid via cryptocurrency. 3 days later, he responded, "This is unusual. The hum pattern matches nothing in standard telecommunications. The encryption bursts are definitely military grade, similar to protocols used in classified systems from the Cold War era. But here's what's really strange. This wasn't made on any consumer equipment available in 2000. The encoding quality suggests professional-grade hardware, possibly military issue. Where did you get this? And why are you asking about it?" I didn't respond. The analyst sent 2 more emails over the next week, increasingly insistent. I need to know where this came from. If this is evidence in a criminal case, I'm obligated to report it. Please respond. I deleted the email account. Ached 3. The Modern Thread. Chapter 6. A New Title Message. November 2nd, 2023. Exactly 23 years after John Titor's first post. I was at work, mindlessly processing insurance claims, when my phone buzzed with a notification I'd set up years ago. An alert that triggered whenever someone mentioned John Titor on certain forums and boards I monitored. Most alerts were false positives, people discussing the old case, sharing theories, nothing new. But this one was different. The alert came from an obscure time travel discussion board that had maybe 20 active users, the kind of place conspiracy theorists went to die quiet deaths of obsession. I opened the page on my phone. A new account had been created that morning. Username timetravel_2036. It had made exactly one post, time-stamped at 3:14 a.m. Ethan Ward, stop digging. This is not your timeline to fix. My hands went numb. I read it again. Then again. My name. My actual name. On a forum I'd never posted on under my real identity. I'd always used aliases when discussing Titor online, careful to never connect my real identity to my research. How did someone know I was investigating? I checked the user profile, created 3 hours ago. No other information, no email listed, no avatar. I clicked on the username to see if there were any other posts. The profile page loaded, account deleted. The post was still there, but the user no longer existed. I screenshot everything, my heart hammering. Then I did something I should have known better than to do. I tried to trace the IP address. The forum had open source server logs available to moderators, and with the right tools, anyone who knew where to look. I found the entry for that post. The IP address was registered to White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. I stared at my screen, certain I'd made a mistake. I ran the trace again. Same result. White Sands. A major military installation. One that happened to be involved in advanced physics research and experimental technologies. I decided to dig deeper. I used a more sophisticated tracking tool, one that showed the path the connection took before posting. That's when things got truly bizarre. The connection originated from White Sands. Then it jumped to CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. Then it vanished completely. No exit node, no further trace, nothing. It simply terminated in the middle of transmission in a way that shouldn't be technically possible. I sat at my desk, surrounded by mundane insurance paperwork, and felt reality tilt slightly off its axis. Someone at White Sands, or someone using their network infrastructure, had posted a message to a forgotten forum telling me specifically to stop investigating John Titor, and they'd routed it through CERN, one of the world's premier particle physics laboratories, the place where they smash atoms and study the fundamental nature of reality, the place where some conspiracy theorists believe time travel research might actually be conducted. Chapter 7. Contact from a coast-to-coast insider. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment with every light on, periodically checking the forum to see if the message was still there or if I'd imagined the whole thing. It was still there. Username deleted, IP trace impossible to run again because the logs had been wiped. At 2:37 a.m, my phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Ethan Ward? A woman's voice, older, tired sounding. Who is this? My name is Amy Jacobs. I used to produce for Coast to Coast AM back when Art was still hosting. I heard you've been asking questions about John Titor. My mouth went dry. How did you hear that? Because I've been monitoring Titor-related searches for 15 years, she said, and you just triggered about 8 different alerts I set up. You found something, didn't you? I don't know what you mean. The audio. You found the anomaly in the audio. Silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. How do you know about that? I finally asked. Because Art found it too, Amy said. Years ago, before he retired. He never talked about it publicly, but he knew something was wrong with those broadcasts. He asked me to analyse them. I found the same thing you did. The hum, the encryption patterns, everything. And then we started getting inquiries from people who shouldn't have been interested, defence contractors, government agencies, someone from a place in Virginia that wouldn't identify themselves directly but was clearly intelligence community. They requested all Titor-related correspondence, all the tapes, all the caller information we had. Did you give it to them? We didn't have a choice. They had paperwork, official requests. Art was furious, but there was nothing he could do. I started pacing my apartment. Why are you calling me? Because you found something we didn't. You got further than we did, and I think you're in danger of stumbling onto something that powerful people want to stay hidden. What did Art think it was? Amy was quiet for a long moment. Art believed a Titor wasn't posting from 2000. He believed Titor was broadcasting into 2000, from somewhere else, someone else. That's impossible. Is it? Explain the encryption patterns. Explain the quantum acoustic signature. Explain how someone in 2000 had information about classified research that wasn't public yet. She paused. Ethan. Art spent the last years of his life quietly investigating this. He never went public because he couldn't prove anything, and because he was scared of what it meant. What did it mean? It meant someone had figured out how to communicate backwards through time, and they were testing it on the most public platform possible, hiding the truth in plain sight, wrapped in conspiracy theory and internet culture, so that anyone who actually believed it would be dismissed as a lunatic. I sat down heavily on my couch. Why would they do that? I don't know, but Art had a theory. He thought Titor's mission wasn't to convince the public of anything. It was to calibrate something, to send controlled messages into the past and measure the effects, to ensure certain future events occurred or were avoided, and Coast to Coast AM, with its global reach and eclectic audience, was the perfect testing ground. That's insane. Is it? Amy asked. You found military-grade encryption in a phone call from 2000. You got a message telling you to stop digging from someone using a military installations network. You're telling me that's normal. I couldn't argue with that. I'm sending you something, Amy said. A file Art gave me before he died. He made me promise to only share it. If someone actually got close to figuring this out, check your email in 5 minutes. Wait! But she'd already hung up. Acket 4. The Conspiracy Twist, Chapter 8. The Fort Meade File. The email arrived exactly 5 minutes later. No message, just an attachment. A scanned PDF labelled Fort Meade Analysis, Titor Case, Classified. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The document was a DARPA memo dated March 2003. Most of it was redacted, black bars covering entire paragraphs. But enough remained to be absolutely terrifying. The header read, Subject, Temporal Communication Leakage, Case Study, Titor Broadcast. The visible portion stated, Signals analysed from Coast to Coast AM, broadcast dated January 2001, show anomalous patterns consistent with temporal offset interference. Frequency analysis reveals quantum acoustic signatures that match predicted outputs from Project Looking Glass prototype systems tested between 1997 and 2000. Conclusion: the subject known as John Titor was either in possession of or in proximity to a temporal displacement device during broadcast transmissions. The signals are consistent with quantum entanglement communication across temporal barriers. Calls correlated with anomalies monitored by NSA's Project Looking Glass observation posts during the same time period, showing temporal probability fluctuations that suggest active manipulation of timeline causality. Recommendation: reclassify case under SAP protocols. Monitor all further Titor-related communications. Suppress public investigation through disinformation and discrediting campaigns. Transfer file oversight to redacted under satellite research contract cover designation. The document was stamped classified and bore the seal of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I read it 5 times. Then I researched Project Looking Glass. The classified project was partially revealed through leaked documents in the mid-2000s. It allegedly involved using experimental technology to view probable future timelines, based on something called the Burish Papers, and connected to research at S4. a rumoured underground facility near Area 51. Most researchers dismissed it as disinformation or fantasy, but here was an official document, or what appeared to be one, connecting it directly to the John Titor case. Chapter 9. Ethan's Realization. I spent 3 days cross-referencing everything I'd found. The audio anomalies, the DARPA memo, Amy's testimony about Art Bell's investigation, the message from White Sands routed through CERN, the Haber connection in Florida. And I realised something that made every conspiracy theory I'd ever read seem tame by comparison. What if John Titor's entire appearance wasn't about convincing anyone of anything? What if it was never meant to be believed? Think about it from the perspective of someone running a temporal communication experiment. You can't just broadcast a message to the past openly. That would cause panic, investigation, immediate government response. You'd never get clean data. You'd corrupt the entire experiment. But what if you wrapped your message in absurdity? What if you made it part of internet culture, conspiracy theory, entertainment? What if you made it just plausible enough to attract attention, but just outlandish enough that anyone who believed it would be dismissed? You could send signals, test equipment, calibrate temporal communication systems, measure causality effects, all while hiding in the noise of the late-night radio and internet forums. Coast to Coast AM was perfect for this. A show dedicated to fringe topics, with a global audience of people predisposed to believe in the strange and unexplained. Broadcast late at night when critical thinking is lower and imagination runs higher. Archived for future reference, but dismissed by mainstream culture. John Titor wasn't trying to warn us of the future. John Titor was calibrating a device, testing whether messages could be sent backward through time and be received intact, ensuring that specific information reached specific points in the timeline, creating a documented test case that could be analysed later to refine the technology. And the predictions that didn't come true, those weren't failures, those were the point. By making predictions that could be explained away with different timelines, Titor ensured that the case would never be definitively solved. It would remain in a state of quantum uncertainty, both real and fake simultaneously, depending on who you asked. The perfect cover for experimental temporal communication technology. I sat in my dark apartment and realised I'd stumbled onto something that was never meant to be understood, until whoever sent the messages wanted it understood. Act 5. The Final Contact. Chapter 10. Ethan receives coordinates. The message appeared on my computer screen at 3:47 a.m. on December 10th, 2023. My computer was off, fully shut down. I'd turned it off hours earlier and unplugged it from the internet, paranoid after everything I'd discovered. But when I woke up to use the bathroom, I saw light coming from my office. My monitor was on, displaying a message in plain text on a black background. You have seen too much. If you want the truth, come to these coordinates. Below the message, latitude and longitude coordinates. My skin went cold. I hadn't imagined the impossible. My computer had turned itself on somehow, despite being physically disconnected from power and network. I grabbed my phone and entered the coordinates into a map application. Gainesville, Florida. A residential address in a suburban neighbourhood. I pulled up the street view. A modest house with a small yard. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that screamed temporal research facility or government conspiracy. But I recognised the area. I'd seen it before in my research. It was near where Larry Haber lived, the lawyer connected to the Titor Foundation, and according to the original Titor posts, it was near the coordinates where John Titor claimed he would return home before leaving our timeline in March 2001. The message on my computer screen flickered. Then new text appeared. You have 48 hours. Come alone. Bring the tape. This is not a request. The screen went black. My computer wouldn't turn back on. Chapter 11. The Empty House. I should have called the police. I should have called Amy. I should have done anything except what I actually did. But I've never been good at making smart decisions when curiosity is involved. I booked a flight to Florida that morning. Red-eye departure, arriving in Gainesville just after dawn. I brought the cassette tape in my carry-on, wrapped in bubble wrap and tucked into a padded case. The house matched the street view images perfectly. Small, single-storey, beige siding, brown roof. A for sale sign in the front yard, faded and crooked like it had been there for months. No cars in the driveway, no signs of occupancy. I sat in my rental car across the street for 20 minutes watching. No movement, no lights, nothing. Finally, I walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. The interior was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, no indication anyone had lived there recently. Just bare walls and carpet that still showed vacuum marks from a cleaning service. But in the centre of the living room floor, there was something. A metal cylinder, about 3 feet tall, 2 feet in diameter, covered in what looked like precision-machined components. Coils, sensors, small crystalline structures embedded in the casing. It was sitting on a circular base covered in symbols that might have been mathematical equations or might have been something else entirely. Next to it, a piece of paper taped to the floor. I walked over slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The note read, in printed text, "This isn't for your world." I stared at the cylinder. It matched the diagrams John Titer had posted back in 2001. The C204 temporal displacement unit, or at least something that looked exactly like those schematics. I reached out to touch it, and the room vibrated, not shaking, not movement. The air itself seemed to vibrate, like reality was suddenly running at the wrong frequency. The hum I'd heard in the audio files filled the space so loud it hurt my teeth. The walls flickered. For just a moment I saw through them, or saw them in a different configuration, different paint colour, different carpet, furniture present where there was none, and then I saw him, standing in the corner of the room wearing what looked like a military-style coat. Dark fabric, heavy duty with patches on the shoulders. One patch was clearly visible. It read, Temporal Recon Division 2036. The figure was shadow-like, not quite solid, like looking at someone through frosted glass. But I could see enough to know it was a person. Male, probably, tall, standing completely still, watching me. We made eye contact, or at least I think we did. It's hard to explain. Looking at him was like looking at someone through water that was flowing in the wrong direction. He raised one hand, not waving, more like a gesture of acknowledgement or warning. Then the vibration stopped. The hum cut off instantly. The room snapped back to normal, empty, quiet, ordinary. The cylinder was gone. The note was gone. I was standing alone in an empty house in Florida, having just experienced something I would never be able to adequately explain. I walked out, got in my rental car, and drove back to the airport. I didn't look back. Epilogue. The case closes itself. I got home to find my computer reformatted. Not wiped, reformatted. Clean operating system installation, all my files gone, including everything related to John Titer. The cassette tape Bill Anders had sold me was blank. I played it front to back, nothing but magnetic hiss. I tried to contact Amy Jacobs. Every phone number I had for her was disconnected. Every email bounced back. I searched for her online and found nothing. No social media, no professional profiles, no obituary, nothing. It was like she'd never existed. I went back to the forum where the message about me had appeared. The post was gone. Not just deleted, gone from the archive, gone from cached versions, gone from the Wayback Machine, like it had never been posted. I checked the Coast to Coast AM archives for the John Titer episodes. Every single one showed as currently unavailable due to rights issues. Art Bell's entire Titer discussion catalogue was inaccessible. I tried to contact Larry Haber again. His law office website was down. His phone number led to a disconnected message. I pulled out the DARPA document Amy had sent me. I opened the file. Blank PDF. 0 pages. Every single piece of evidence I'd collected over 2 months of investigation was gone. Erased. Disappeared like it had never existed. The only thing I had left was my memory. And even that felt uncertain now. Like maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown. Maybe the insomnia and the obsession had finally caught up with me, and I'd hallucinated an entire conspiracy. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what I experienced. And I think I finally understand what John Titor really was. Time travel might not be about visiting the past. It might be about editing it, adjusting the timeline in subtle ways, ensuring certain events occur or don't occur, sending information backward to specific points to calibrate and refine the ability to manipulate causality. And if you can edit the past, you can also edit the present. You can remove evidence, erase records, make sure investigations never happened. I think John Titor, or whoever was behind that name, returned to make sure my investigation disappeared. Not by threatening me, not by silencing me, but by retroactively ensuring I never had anything to investigate in the first place. Which means either I'm crazy, or I'm one of the few people who remembers a version of events that no longer exists in our timeline. I still listen to Coast, still stay up late, unable to sleep, chasing mysteries and conspiracies. But I don't research time travel anymore. I don't dig into classified projects or unexplained phenomena. Because now I know that some cases aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be buried. And sometimes, if you dig too deep, the case buries you instead. If you found yourself listening to this entire story and wanting to know more, I hope you'll use your hype points on the video if you enjoyed it. It genuinely helps the channel in ways you might not realise, and we're grateful for every single one of you who takes the time to support what we do here. Drop a comment if you feel like it. Tell us what time it is where you are, where you're listening from in the world. We love seeing where all of you are tuning in from, across time zones and continents. But more importantly, if you've ever experienced something you can't explain, something that doesn't quite fit with the reality you think you know, maybe keep it to yourself. Some truths aren't meant to be shared. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because in the end, the John Titor case taught me one thing above all else. Reality is more fragile than we think. And sometimes the people who try to understand how fragile it is are the ones who find out just how easily it can be edited, adjusted, and rewritten. I'm Ethan Ward, and this is the case I shouldn't have reopened. Sleep well, everyone, and remember, some timelines are better left unexplored.